The Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, is moments away from handing down the federal budget. In the background, you can hear what they call the bells, summoning members to the House of Representatives to listen to what is one of the most significant documents of the parliamentary year. This comes at a time of conflict and great economic uncertainty. Households across the country are feeling the pain of rising prices from an energy supply shock caused by the war in the Middle East and 3 interest rate hikes in a row, the last of them announced just a week ago. In the face of that uncertainty, the government's been hinting at big changes tonight, especially in the area of tax concessions that benefit investors over first home buyers. Tonight, we'll see what form they take, and will the soaring cost of living entice the government to offer some relief to struggling households, even though the Reserve Bank governor warned last week that handouts would make the job of taming inflation even more difficult. We can see now the Speaker of the House, Milton Dick, about to call on the Treasurer to stand to deliver this budget. These are live pictures from the House of Representatives. Immediately after this, we'll see the Treasurer race off for his first post-budget interview with the ABC when he's interviewed by Sarah Ferguson. Let's cross now to the House of Representatives.
Speaker, I present the Appropriation Bill number 1, 2627 and the explanatory memorandum.
Call the clerk.
First reading, a bill for an act to appropriate money out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund for the ordinary annual services of the government and for related purposes.
I give the call to the Treasurer.
Yeah. I acknowledge the Ngunnawal people here and the Yagara and the Yugambeh people back home in Logan, and I move that this bill be now read a second time. Speaker, this is the most important and ambitious budget in decades. Important because the world is throwing a lot at us, and this budget is about helping Australia deal with those challenges. And ambitious because we have so much going for us, and this budget is about Australia seizing those opportunities. War in the Middle East has been pushing up prices, pushing down growth and punishing Australians. It has exposed weaknesses in the global economy and intensified long-standing challenges here at home. We didn't decide when this war began, and we have no control over when it will properly end. But how we respond is up to us, how we help each other through, and how we come out of this a stronger, fairer, more productive and more resilient nation. This budget is ambitious in the face of adversity. It's a responsible budget and it's a reforming budget, which builds resilience and bolsters our economy. There is more cost of living relief, more Medicare and more aged care, and more housing. It makes the tax system fairer and stronger for workers, businesses, first home buyers and future generations, responding to the pressures of the here and now while embracing our intergenerational responsibilities. The core of this budget is an economic strategy with 5 main parts. Getting through the global oil shock and building resilience. Taking the pressure off people where we can. Making the economy more productive to lift living standards over time. Reforming the tax system for workers, businesses and future generations, including a new tax cut for every working Australian taxpayer. Yeah. And making the budget stronger, more sustainable and helping to take the pressure off inflation by saving more than we spend. Speaker, we are dealing with the 5th economic shock in less than 20 years. The conflict in the Middle East and closure of the Strait of Hormuz has disrupted the global economy and the global outlook. Oil production fell by 8 million barrels a day in the first month of the war, almost 8 times more than any of the oil shocks we've seen since the 1970s. The global oil price started the year around $60 and has now been above $100 for the bulk of the past 2 months. A third of the world's seaborne fertiliser has been stuck, putting pressure on food production, food security and supermarket prices. All of this has made the outlook more uncertain. Treasury's central forecast assume oil stays around $100 a barrel until the end of next month and glides to $80 by the end of June next year. On that assumption, it would still be above its pre-conflict price in 12 months' time. This means Treasury now expects global growth to slow from 3.5% last year to just 3% this year. Inflation is spiking all around the world, and Australia is not immune from these global price rises. Australians have been paying a hefty price for this war at the Bowser and beyond. We were already dealing with price pressures in our economy, but Treasury is now forecasting inflation to peak around 5% in the middle of the year because of the conflict. For the same reasons, it's expecting growth to come in 0.5 percentage point lower next financial year to be 1.75% overall. In this budget, Treasury also presents a more severe scenario where the oil price peaks at $200 a barrel and takes 3 years to fall back down. We'd still avoid a recession, but unemployment would spike to pre-pandemic levels and inflation would peak above 7%. As Australians, we confront these serious challenges together from a position of strength. We are much better placed and better prepared than most countries to deal with this global crisis. Growth here is still higher than our peers. Real incomes have been growing strongly. Unemployment is historically low, and we have one of the strongest budgets in the world. Before the war, GDP growth was strengthening and broadening. The outlook for business investment remains robust, with a solid pipeline of data centre and renewable energy projects. Employment is still growing, and even if unemployment ticks up as expected, it will still stay around the mid-4s. Nominal wages growth is expected to remain above 3%, and annual real wage growth will return from next year, after growing for 8 of the last 9 quarters. Now, we know there's more work to do because the immediate costs and consequences of this war are already serious and they could be severe. At the same time, our economy is being reshaped by structural shifts across energy, industry, technology, demography and geopolitics. And we have long-standing challenges when it comes to our productivity performance, our housing market and our tax system. This budget is about getting us through the global oil shock and taking pressure off Australians, while building a stronger economy, a better tax system, a more sustainable budget, and lifting living standards for our people. Speaker, we are responding to the biggest oil shock in history with a comprehensive $14.8 billion plan to secure more fuel, strengthen our supply chains, build resilience, and take the sting out of prices. The Strengthening Australia's Fuel Resilience Package will deliver more fuel for drivers and industry, more fertiliser for farmers, and more fuel security for our economy. Its centrepiece is a $10 billion investment in immediate fuel supplies and a permanent Australian fuel security reserve to get the fuels and fertiliser that we need. We're helping businesses and manufacturers bolster supply chains with $1 billion in interest-free loans through the National Reconstruction Fund and incentives to get more freight moving on trains and ships. Targeted support for electric vehicles, building more charging stations and heavy vehicle reform are all investments in our long-term fuel resilience. We'll produce more fuel through our $1.1 billion Cleaner Fuels program, backed with reforms to our low-carbon liquid fuels market to support demand. We're reserving 20% of gas exports for Australian users, so there's more supply at lower prices. And we're making more progress on our Future Made in Australia agenda, supporting mining and processing through our Critical Minerals Strategic Reserve and investments in domestic smelting and manufacturing. Speaker, we understand that this crisis is adding to the cost of living pressures facing Australians. And that's why we are taking some of the sting out of global price rises by more than halving the fuel excise, reducing the heavy vehicle road user charge to zero, putting petrol companies on notice by doubling the consumer watchdog's maximum penalties and ramping up enforcement and monitoring, giving businesses a bit more leeway at tax time if they're facing fuel supply problems, and continuing to make it easier and quicker for small businesses to get access to credit if they need it. Speaker, immediate relief from the fuel crisis is coupled with lasting and responsible cost of living measures. This government cut taxes 2 years ago. We're cutting them again this year and next year too. Tonight we're proud to be delivering another round of ongoing tax cuts for Australian workers. We will put more money into the pockets of 13.3 million workers with a new $250 Working Australians tax offset. It will begin from the second half of 2027 and be paid each year after that, ongoing and automatically, in your tax return, just like the instant deduction that we are rolling out as well. This offset is targeted to workers and it represents the most meaningful, permanent increase to the effective tax-free threshold since Labor increased it more than a decade ago. Altogether, our 5 different tax cuts will benefit the average worker by up to $2,816 in 2028. Averaged out over the year, our 3 tax cuts, our instant deduction and the new offset are the equivalent of up to $54 back in the average earner's pocket each week. Now, the $6.4 billion tax offset is the biggest cost of living measure in this budget, but it's not all we're doing to support families under pressure. As a Labor government, we will always invest in Medicare and cheaper medicines and public health so Australians get the care that they need and when they need it. This budget includes another $25 billion for public hospitals. We're also investing $5.9 billion to list more medicines on the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme, so Australians continue to access life-changing medicines at cheaper prices. One example is cutting the cost of treatment for cystic fibrosis will save some Australians around $250,000 a year. Medicare urgent care clinics reduce out-of-pocket costs because more bulk billing means less pressure on household budgets and emergency departments. By July, 4 in 5 Australians will live within a 20-minute drive of one of the 137 clinics around the country. We're permanently funding every one of them with $1.8 billion over the next 4 years and about $500 million every year after that. Speaker, Australia's long-standing housing shortage is making homes unaffordable. This challenge hits young workers and families hard, and we're addressing it from every responsible angle. The reforms in this budget will lift our total investment in housing to a record $47 billion. We're levelling the playing field for first home buyers with 5% deposits and tax reform to help more young Australians into their own home. We'll invest another $2 billion in the power, roads and drains that we need for new housing developments, which will help around 65,000 new homes over the next decade. We're working with the states to cut red tape and planning delays, which could unlock tens of thousands more. We're extending our ban on foreign investors buying existing homes to take pressure off the market and helping to fix the youth housing penalty to secure homes for 4,000 young people at risk of homelessness. Speaker, these housing reforms go to the very core of our budget strategy, dealing with the very real pressures on people right now while taking responsibility for the challenges facing the next generations. The shocks from around the world are coming at us faster and more frequently. And that global uncertainty is not a reason to delay reform. It's why we must move with urgency and with ambition. The challenges coming at us, the opportunities ahead of us and the better future that Australians deserve will not wait for a time when all is quiet in the world. That's why this budget invests in resilience and reform to grow our economy the right way and lift living standards over time. We'll do that through 3 ambitious policy packages: a productivity and investment package, a tax reform package and a savings package as well. Because, Speaker, to lift wages and living standards, we have to lift productivity. In the market sector, productivity has now grown for 5 consecutive quarters, was 1.5% last year. But this budget is about going further and moving faster. This productivity package will help us attract and absorb more investment, make it easier and quicker to build, and it will slash compliance costs. The reforms we are announcing tonight will cut regulatory costs by $10.2 billion every year. Our efforts in national competition policy alone could boost GDP by $13 billion a year. This is the broadest productivity push in a budget since the 1990s. Speaker, our productivity plan starts with incentivising investment and innovation through the tax system for businesses, startups and venture capital. We're cutting the unnecessary red tape holding us back, including $780 million every year in the financial sector alone. We're also making tax time simpler for small businesses, which will save them 376,000 hours a year. We're getting rid of almost 600 more tariffs to reduce trade barriers, as well as expanding our Trusted Trader program and streamlining biosecurity for fertiliser imports. We're also building a single national market through our national competition policy reforms, so Australia works as one economy, not 8, with new work to make mandatory standards free for workers and businesses. And we're making government simpler to deal with through a tell us once approach so Australians don't have to keep submitting the same information, and expanding the digital ID. We will speed up approvals so businesses can move quickly from an investment decision to shovels in the ground. That's the motivation behind our environmental law reforms, the investor front door and a second round of foreign investment changes. We'll also simplify building regulations for when these projects begin construction. And we're doing more on skills recognition and education, so tradies can get their qualifications recognised more easily and businesses can find the skilled workers that they need. We're progressing the most significant reforms to the national electricity market since the 1990s as the world moves to net zero, including changes to help attract more investment in renewable energy and increase competition. We're also modernising our energy system with a domestic gas reservation and getting more solar and batteries into homes, which could save $7 billion in systems costs by 2050. We're seizing the vast opportunities from AI with grants to commercialise AI innovations and making government more efficient. We're investing billions more in science and innovation through the Medical Research Future Fund and in the CSIRO and the Square Kilometre Array, and billions in the infrastructure that we need to get people to work and to improve our regions, towns and cities. We're also strengthening the performance test, so our $4.5 trillion super sector isn't being discouraged from investing productive capital in areas like energy and housing. Speaker, the productivity package is ambitious and so are our tax reforms. This budget includes the most significant tax reform package in more than a quarter of a century. This is about tax relief and tax reform to make our economy work for more Australians, for more businesses and future generations. We're delivering a fairer tax system for workers, first-time buyers and young people. This will help rebalance a system which is more generous to assets than it is to labour, and help rebalance a system where house prices have decoupled from incomes. Since 1999, house prices have risen over 400%, more than twice as fast as average incomes. Our tax changes will help about 75,000 Australians achieve the dream of home ownership. We'll limit negative gearing for residential property to new builds from July next year. And we're replacing the 50% capital gains tax discount with inflation-adjusted indexation to restore the taxation of real gains. These changes will be prospective, and new builds will retain the option to use the 50% discount. We'll also introduce a minimum 30% tax rate on capital gains from July next year and on discretionary trust from July the year after. This is about better aligning the taxes paid on these types of income with the taxes paid on wages. These changes will level the playing field for workers and first home buyers and support investment in productive assets, including new housing supply. And they will fund our new round of tax relief for more than 13 million Australian workers. So, Speaker, we're building a better tax system for businesses too, with over $3.5 billion in new measures that lower taxes to encourage investment and innovation. We'll permanently introduce 2-year loss carryback for all companies up to $1 billion in turnover, bolstering resilience and risk-taking. And we'll introduce loss refundability for startups to help new businesses invest and grow in their first 2 years. We'll also expand tax incentives for venture capital and better target the research and development tax incentive to support more high-impact innovation. The third part of our tax reform package is to make the tax system simpler and more sustainable. Simpler for workers with a $1,000 instant deduction, and simpler for small businesses with a permanent instant asset write-off and more dynamic tax instalments. And we'll put in place more sustainable long-term settings to support the take-up of electric vehicles. Speaker, our tax reforms will help workers, create a fairer housing market and drive more productive investment across our economy. They build on the significant reforms we've already delivered, and they complement our other efforts to increase housing supply and boost productivity and reduce compliance costs. The new revenue raised will be returned to workers and businesses over the next 4 years so that more Australians can earn more and keep more of what they earn. Yeah. So, Speaker, this means the heavy lifting on budget repair is being done by savings and spending restraint, not tax increases. This budget delivers the largest savings package on record. All up, there are $63.8 billion in savings. Our decisions improve the budget in net terms by $26.1 billion once you take our responsible provisions into account. A big part of our savings package will restore the NDIS to its original intent and secure its future so it grows in a sustainable way in line with programs like Medicare. This difficult but necessary reform will save $37.8 billion over the forward estimates. On top of savings, there's also very substantial spending restraint. Real spending growth averages just 1.5% for the 8 years to June 2030. This is the lowest average growth rate in any 8-year period for almost 3.5 decades and less than half the 30-year average. As a result of all of this, we've returned every single dollar of revenue upgrades to the bottom line for the second consecutive update. Payments as a share of the economy are forecast to go down from 26.8% next year to 26.2% by the middle of 2030. Now, this responsible economic management means that the budget deficit next financial year is $2.8 billion lower at $31.5 billion. The bottom line is better in every year over the forward estimates and the medium term. The budget position has improved by $44.9 billion, and this makes it more than $250 billion better than when we came to office. Yeah. Gross debt will be $982 billion at the end of this financial year, and it peaks lower, it peaks earlier, and is lower in every year for the next 11 years. And this means, in share of economy terms, gross and net debt remain well below what we inherited in every year going forward. Yeah. Debt is lower and the budget position is stronger in every year of the medium term because of our savings. The medium-term budget position is much stronger and more sustainable as a consequence, creating more room for future tax relief. Speaker, we've made progress getting the budget in much better shape at the same time as we've found room to fund the services and the security that Australians rely on. This budget includes record investments in healthcare, defence and economic resilience. There's $3 billion to deliver more beds, more packages and better aged care for older Australians. $2 billion for the Thriving Kids program and a $3 billion provision for other foundational supports outside the NDIS. And $2.2 billion to strengthen Services Australia and ensure that Australians continue to receive safe, secure and reliable services quickly and easily. Speaker, we're building an economy which is stronger and fairer and gives more Australians a stake in our success. We're investing an extra $1.2 billion to close the gap, doubling the number of jobs created as part of the Remote Jobs and Economic Development program, improving housing quality and expanding our support for grocery stores in remote First Nations communities. Speaker, the gender pay gap has never been narrower and women's workforce participation hit record highs last year. We're proud to have backed $21 billion in wage rises for women working in sectors like aged care and early childhood education, which have been undervalued for too long. Yeah. Since 2022, we've also invested more than $4.4 billion to deliver the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children. And this budget includes hundreds of millions of dollars for frontline services and to make our child support system safer so children get this financial support that they need and women are protected from abuse. Yeah. Speaker, economic security, economic resilience and national security are now one and the same. We're investing an additional $53 billion over the next decade in our Defence Force to keep Australians and our region safe. And there's almost $800 million for veterans as part of our response to the Royal Commission into defence and veteran suicide. We're also taking action to strengthen our national security and our national unity since the devastating anti-Semitic terror attack at Bondi Beach. We're adopting every recommendation from the Royal Commission on Anti-Semitism and Social Cohesion's interim report, and we're fast-tracking tougher gun laws through the National Cabinet. There is $600 million in this budget for a new counter-terrorism online centre, grants to support affected communities, and money for our law enforcement agencies to crack down on the hate speech, the violent extremism and the terrorism which has absolutely no place in this country. So, Speaker, against the backdrop of global uncertainty, this budget invests in Australia's resilience, its economic sovereignty and its national security. And at a time when Australians are under pressure, this budget delivers more help with the cost of living and new tax cuts for workers. And in an era where people feel like the system no longer works for them, this budget doesn't just acknowledge that, it acts on it. By levelling the playing field for first home buyers, backing the aspiration and innovation of small businesses, and renewing that fundamental bargain between generations to help bring the dream of home ownership within reach of more young Australians. No other budget in the 2000s has set out this much responsible budget repair and this much economic reform. These are difficult decisions to ensure a stronger bottom line every year, to give us greater insurance in uncertain times, at the same time as we build a more resilient, more productive and competitive economy. This is a strategy which helps shield people from the harshest consequences of a global oil crisis, stabilises our economy and our budget at a time of extreme uncertainty and volatility in the world, and strengthens Australia for the next shock. Faced with a choice between resilience or reform, this budget demonstrates that our government and our country are capable of both. Tonight we choose the hard road of reform, not the path of least resistance, by responding to the pressures that Australians confront today and fulfilling our obligations and our responsibilities to the generations to come. And that, Mr Speaker, is why I commend this bill and this budget to the House.
Hello and welcome to this budget special edition of 7:30. I'm Sarah Ferguson. That was the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, delivering his fifth budget, a budget the government is calling the most important and ambitious in decades. Shortly, I'll be joined by the Treasurer for his first post-budget interview, and later in the programme you'll also hear from the Shadow Treasurer, Tim Wilson, for the opposition's response. Tonight, the Treasurer has announced major changes to negative gearing, trusts and the capital gains tax discount, all to address a housing crisis the government says has locked young people out of home ownership and is now straining our social fabric. National Affairs correspondent Jane Norman.
Their first budget since Labor's landslide victory. The government's economic duo spending some political capital
G'day everybody.
and putting some money back in workers' pockets. Tonight unveiling another income tax cut or working Australians' tax offset.
So is it Waito or Watto?
Waito.
13 million workers to get $250 back at tax time from 2028 and every year thereafter. The new measure on top of already legislated tax cuts, costing the budget $6.4 billion over 4 years.
So why do we have to wait another 2 years for Waito?
Well, we do as much tax relief as we can afford to do, and it's not the only tax relief that we are providing.
The tax cut to be paid for by increasing taxes on property investors and trusts. From next year, only investors building new homes will be able to use negative gearing. The 50% capital gains tax discount will go. Instead, the tax will apply to the profit made minus inflation with a minimum 30% tax rate. Existing investors to be exempt. The change is estimated to help 75,000 more Australians buy their first home. But this is a policy U-turn.
Do you reckon voters will forgive you for breaking an election commitment?
The easiest thing in the world would be to leave these tax breaks in place exactly as they are, but it's locking too many people, particularly young people, out of the housing market. And so we've come to a different view for the right reasons.
Property prices won't fall according to Treasury, but they'll grow more slowly. Rents expected to rise by $2 a week. Family trusts also targeted. From 2028, the tax on distributions to be lifted to 30%. All up, the 3 tax hikes to raise $8.1 billion over 4 years. The aim to rebalance the tax system.
So that people who work for a living and earn wages are not treated substantially differently from people who make their income in other ways.
The government's income is up. GST revenue $1.7 billion higher than forecast this financial year. The petroleum resource rent tax up $400 million. Both thanks to the conflict in the Middle East that's forced the government to spend billions cutting the fuel tax until July and building up Australia's fuel reserves. But there are some big savings. $36 billion cut from the NDIS and billions more axing a private health insurance discount for over 65s and reducing the use of contractors and labour hire companies. The combined effect improving the budget bottom line.
This year's deficit is slightly lower at $28 billion. The budget to remain in the red over the forward estimates, with a glimmer of hope beyond that. Treasury forecasting a surplus in a decade. Net debt expected to climb to $767 billion by 2030.
The budget is stronger, the deficits are smaller and debt is lower.
Inflation's now expected to peak at 5% this year, slowing to 2.5% from next year. Wages growth forecast to increase to 3.5% at the same time, meaning a real wage rise for workers. But there's a big but. If the Iran war continues, Treasury's warning inflation could remain persistently high, even hitting 7% if the price of oil doubles.
Heavily dependent, heavily hostage to developments overseas.
The war slowing economic growth too. It's been revised down to a sluggish 1.75% next year before rising again. Despite that, the jobless rate forecast to hover around 4.5%. One more figure worth mentioning, 54. That's the number of times the word uncertainty features in the main budget book.
Tonight's budget comes amid roiling unrest and uncertainty, as Jane just mentioned, here and across the world. A febrile political and economic environment the government says demands bold reform. 730's political editor Jacob Grieber has this analysis.
Ever since its stunning election victory of a year ago, supporters and critics alike have begged the government to use its thumping majority to take more political risks. Tonight's budget is Labor's biggest roll of the dice since coming to office 4 years ago. It has embarked, in its own words, on the most consequential tax reform package in a quarter of a century. This is more than hyperbole. The political and economic risks of what it's undertaking are considerable. But if it works, Labor hopes its changes to the taxation and distribution of wealth will set it up for a third term and offer voters a counter-narrative against rising populist politics. It seeks to balance immediate challenges, fallout from the war in the Middle East by spending billions on energy resilience, and an inflation dragon by largely avoiding the temptation to shower short-term sugar hits on struggling households. With the long-term challenges caused by an ageing population, weak economic growth and a tax system the government argues favours older Australians with accumulated wealth over working-age taxpayers who are struggling to form families, buy homes and pay off debt. The centrepiece of Jim Chalmers' fifth budget is a shake-up of negative gearing, capital gains tax and family trusts. most of which the Prime Minister ruled out on dozens of occasions leading up to last year's election. While these changes will almost certainly find a welcoming Senate crossbench, Labor's political opponents will condemn them as a naked cash grab at the expense of older, wealthier Australians. But the government says its tax changes will help about 75,000 younger Australians over 10 years attain the dream of home ownership. And is further sweetening the deal with a tax offset for working Australians, a tweak that excludes retirees and welfare recipients. The politics of how this budget lands could depend on how three groups of people react. The first are those who've been baying for the Prime Minister to spend his political capital. Anthony Albanese has a personal conviction that tonight's announcements embody a direct challenge to those voters, a moment for them to step up and back the government. Even though a significant portion will be well-heeled retirees, many will face paying more in tax on their assets. The second group are younger voters, which the government says will be the beneficiaries of its tax changes. But this same cohort, millennials and Gen Z, will also be watching as millions of baby boomers and Gen Xers continue to benefit from grandfathered asset tax rules. The third group will be those who won't forgive the government for breaking its promises at the last election. The Treasurer is under no illusions about the coming political fight and has acknowledged that what the government is doing will be controversial.
This budget is for first home buyers and it's for workers, it's for small businesses and it's for future generations.
For one thing, it's not clear the changes will do much to simplify Australia's tax system. Accountants and financial advisors are among tonight's biggest winners. There's also no question the reforms will raise a lot of new money. Indeed, Treasury calculates the tax package will improve the budget bottom line by $77 billion over the next 10 years. And the government should get credit for making plans to curb spending growth, particularly in the NDIS. But the question for the Reserve Bank will be whether enough is being done in the short term to cool inflationary pressures. More broadly, the ultimate question is whether governments can break promises and still prevail.
The Treasurer has made his way from the floor of the House of Representatives to the studio and joins me now. Congratulations on the budget and welcome.
Thanks very much, Sarah.
As Jacob just pointed out, negative gearing capital gains, the Prime Minister categorically ruled out these changes before the election. Will you first acknowledge the broken promises and then we can talk about why?
Yes, I acknowledge that the government's come to a different view about some really important policy areas. The comments and commitments we made at the election reflected the government's almost singular focus on housing supply. We're maintaining that focus on supply. But the challenge begins there, it doesn't end there with supply. We also need to take these decisive steps, these contentious steps to rebalance the tax system, because the interaction of the housing market and the tax system is locking too many Australians, particularly young Australians, out.
No acknowledgement of broken promises, despite the fact that they are blindingly obvious to everybody watching. Breaking ironclad election promises so blatantly, you must have spent a long time calculating the consequences. When did you decide that the rewards outweighed the risks?
Well, I think it's important to see these changes for the substance of the changes, not the politics of the changes.
There's always politics as well, Treasurer.
Well, this decision was taken in recent weeks. It was taken relatively late in the budget process. And it was taken because we became increasingly of the view that the focus on supply, which is still the main game when it comes to the housing market, was not enough to deal with some of these intergenerational issues in particular when it comes to housing. Now, obviously, we are aware that people who want to defend the current tax arrangements, or they think that the current housing market is working just fine, they will want to focus on this element of it, the political element of it. I understand that. Obviously, that doesn't come as a massive surprise to me. But we're focused on the substantive issue, the substantive change. We've come to a different view on these policy areas. We're explaining to the Australian people why.
You just said recent weeks. The decision to make these major changes to negative gearing, trusts and capital gains was made in recent weeks. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it is what I'm saying. The
how many
Expenditure Review Committee finalises the budget in the usual way towards the end of April, sometimes the beginning of May. Obviously, this has involved a fair amount of work, but the decision was taken in recent weeks to make this policy change. And more than deciding this policy change and the substantive difference that we hope to make, encouraging another 75,000 Australians into the housing market over the next decade, rebalancing the playing field when it comes to housing and tax. Obviously, we know that that invites an element of political risk. Obviously, these changes have been contentious for some time. And so you asked me before, would I acknowledge that we've come to this different view? We have.
But we've come to this. The question was about broken promises.
Well, we've come to this different view for very good reasons, and I'm here to explain to your view as well.
Yep. Now, you are presenting this as a major change, quite reasonably, rebalancing the system, the whole system, in favour of workers and in particular young people. But how do you justify not doing that before the election, where the conditions were not materially different to where they are now?
Well, the commitments we made at the election, as I said, were overwhelmingly about investing more than $40 billion in housing supply.
The Prime Minister ruling out these changes.
Yeah, but that reflected our focus at the time, which was almost exclusively on supply plus the 5% deposits. And they were the positions that we held at the time. It's become increasingly clear to us that if we continue to kick the can down the road on some of these difficult policy changes, which have been ignored in our tax system and our housing market for too long, then that would make life harder and lock more Australians out of the system. And so we had a choice. I mean, fundamentally, this budget was a choice. Did we use what's happening in the Middle East as a reason to do less, to just focus on fuel security and some of the near-term measures? Or do we understand that all of this global volatility and uncertainty is a reason to accelerate reform, to act with more decisiveness and more urgency? And we decided on the latter path, and I'm proud that we did. And I know that there will be, of course, there will be people who want to focus on the commitments we made at the election. I understand that.
But it's not just that you accept it, that it's reasonable. As I said before, the conditions that existed before the election are not materially different now in terms of the difficulty of obtaining housing. Why did it take a war in the Middle East to make you reset your policies so drastically?
Well, it's another year of too many people getting locked out of the market, and some of these challenges.
But you accept there's no substantial change in terms of the locking out of the market between now and 12 months ago at the time?
We became increasingly of the view that some of these other challenges which go beyond supply, they go to the composition of the market, they go to the fact that tax policy settings have had, I think, a negative impact on the housing market. When these policies were changed in 1999, it fundamentally distorted the way that investment happens in this country, encouraged people to pile into existing housing, pushed prices up, locked people out of the housing market, particularly younger people. And so we've had another year of that. And these challenges will become more and more serious if we neglect them for longer, and that's why we came to a different view and changed our policy.
In the end, is the calculation also that hundreds of thousands of young voters will care more about getting access to housing than they will do about the notion of trust in politics? Is that the calculation also?
Well, I think that people care more about the substantive issue and the substantive change. That's my personal view, and it remains to be seen. There will be people very focused on the politics of the last election campaign. I understand that.
It's also a question about integrity. It's not just politics with a small p, it's integrity in politics, isn't it?
I think people will be most focused on the positive change that we're making in the tax system and in the housing market. It has obviously involved a level of political risk because we come to a different view. And I've said in recent days, and I really mean it, one of the reasons I'm here taking these characteristically difficult questions from you, Sarah, is because I do understand when you come to a different view, you have to front up and explain why, and that's why I'm doing it.
We respect that. Will there be fewer homes built because of these policies, as the Prime Minister said before the election when ruling out these policy changes?
We have to look at our housing package in its entirety. So our housing package is not just these tax changes, as important as they are. There's another $2 billion to invest in more supply, and so the net effect of our housing policy across the budget is to increase supply, and that's really important because supply is still the main game.
So those 35,000 fewer houses
are more than made up for, almost double as many when it comes to the additional investments we're making in supply. In
the speech you gave just now, you identify the huge increase in property prices over the last 25 years as essentially as a great Australian wrong. Will prices now fall?
Prices will grow more slowly in the Treasury modelling that we've released alongside the budget. Prices will continue to grow, but about 2% slower on a median house that's about $19,000. But what we're doing here is we're not targeting a particular price. What we're trying to do is to make sure that there are more affordable options for people to buy, particularly people who are buying their first home. We're trying to make sure that these tax arrangements, where they are concessional, encourage people to build new houses and new units. That's another thing that the package does. But most of all, what we're trying to do in this tax reform package is to deal with this issue where the big distortion that was introduced in 1999 is rectified, at the same time as we try and better align the way that we tax people who work in relation to how we tax people who make their income in other legitimate ways. We're trying to rebalance the tax system.
Let's talk about the grandfathering. That is how you are dealing with those people who are currently negatively gearing their properties, forgive me. Essentially, this creates two tiers of property investors, those who are lucky enough to keep their negative gearing tax advantages and those who are not. Are you comfortable with a two-tier investment system like that?
Well, a lot of the transitional arrangements are about recognising and respecting decisions that people have already taken, and so overwhelmingly the tax policy is prospective rather than retrospective. People who want to still invest in homes and negatively gear those homes can do that if they make a contribution to housing supply and do that with new homes. So that will continue to be available to people who want to make new investments.
But just on the question of that grandfathering, if I may, the budget papers show that you'll be able to build 75,000 households over 10 years, or 75,000 households will be able to buy their first home under these policies. Would that number have been higher if you had taken even tougher decisions on grandfathering?
Well, obviously the numbers in the modelling would be different if we made different decisions. But don't forget as well,
homes available to people.
Don't forget as well, Sarah, when it comes to the grandparenting arrangements, the transitional arrangements, is that houses and properties which are negatively geared are often not negatively geared forever. Typically between 5 or 10 years later they become positively geared. So that there's an element of transition built into the system already, and that will continue to be the case. But if you're a new investor, you can invest in new supply. But what we're doing here is making a meaningful difference to the number of people who can get into the housing market for the first time. That's our objective.
Let's talk about some of those most vulnerable people in that category, that is renters. Will these changes mean fewer rentals and higher rental prices?
Well, once again, you've got to look at the housing package in its entirety. We have presented some modelling around rent and we have presented some modelling around housing supply, but that's only for the tax changes. And we're not only changing the tax system when it comes to housing. So the net effect of the extra homes will put downward pressure on rents, even as the tax changes make a modest difference in the other direction.
So it depends on all of the pieces working together, but you will get, in the short term, you will get slightly lower, you will get higher, there'll be fewer rentals available and slightly higher prices.
Not in its entirety. You have to look at right across the budget. You can pull out any one change. What matters is the net effect. We're building more homes, that will put downward pressure on rents.
There's a new tax offset that people will get in 2028. Is that delayed in order to avoid stoking inflation, as the Reserve Bank Governor has repeatedly warned against?
Look, partly, but that's not the main reason. The main reason is to align it to when we're raising some of this revenue through some of these other changes that we are talking about. We provide tax relief in all kinds of different ways, 5 different ways to cut income taxes, but we have to do that in a responsible and affordable way, and in this instance it's by aligning it with the other revenue measures in the tax reform package. And what that means is we're actually returning the revenue from those difficult tax changes to workers and to businesses over the forward estimates, and that means that where we're seeing all this budget repair, it's not being done by the tax reform package over the forward estimates, it's being done by our responsible approach to savings.
I've got a question to you about that, because your tax package appears to improve the budget's bottom line by $77 billion over 10 years. Is that how much extra tax you are taking?
That's the 10-year period. Over the forward estimates, it is broadly neutral. And over the 10-year period, what we've put in that medium-term projection assumes that there's no more returning of bracket creep. There will be more tax relief. But the $77 billion figure that you cite is accurate. It is creating more room for us to return more bracket creep over time. But the main driver of that very significant and very substantial improvement in the medium-term budget position is actually from our savings. By the end of that 10-year period, the contribution of savings is 3 times the contribution of our tax reform. So once again, the heavy lifting on budget repair is being done by spending restraint and savings in the budget in important areas like the NDIS.
If this budget is framed to some degree around social cohesion, the need to change the housing arrangements, particularly for young Australians, because of the contribution that is making and will make towards social cohesion. So how do you explain a net migration number that will be higher than expected for 2 years, given that that will put pressure on housing?
Well, first of all, on the specifics of the net overseas migration numbers, they've come down by 45% from their peak. So we have very substantially managed down net overseas migration.
What direction are they heading in the next 2 years?
The two smallish revisions to net overseas migration are about fewer departures rather than a spike in arrivals. And even after that, they are still down very, very substantially from the surge that we inherited from our predecessors.
You accept that's still putting pressure on the housing market today?
We're taking pressure off the housing market by taking a serious approach to housing. Our predecessors didn't do that. Now, you've asked me about social cohesion. One of the things that worries me most about our society is this idea that too many people have that we can't let take hold in our society, which is that a fair society is a feature of our past but not a feature of our future. One of the things that keeps me awake at night, one of the defining motivations in this budget, is we have to make the fair go the defining characteristic of our country in future generations, not just in past generations.
But do you also, at the same time, have to level with young people to whom you are making this grand offer that we will never go back to the kind of ratios we saw between housing prices and wages in the past? Do you need to tell them that at the same time?
Well, it remains to be seen, but the efforts that we're making in the budget, the difficult, contentious decisions that we've taken...
That ratio's gone up 9 times, so we're not going back to
If you look at
past.
house price growth since the Howard change in 1999, house prices have gone up around 400%. Income has gone up by about half of that. The Howard Costello changes decoupled house prices from incomes, and that's a problem. And no Treasurer has sat here on budget night and done more to address that particular challenge for a quarter of a century than this Treasurer.
Just on the issue of budget repair, your promised committed budget repair in these papers, of course, depends to a very large degree on the extremely difficult task of fixing the NDIS. Will you be tough enough to hold the line when it becomes clear how many needy people are being excluded from a scheme that had promised to support them? Yeah,
and the reason why I'm confident about that is because we believe in the NDIS and we're trying to save it from itself. We could not have a sustainable scheme that was growing as fast as it was, and so as big believers in the scheme, big supporters of providing a level of care that people need and deserve in our local communities.
Should you be essentially putting an asterisk on those budget papers? It's a very ambitious change. Your budget repair depends on it. There's a lot of people who think that it's unrealistic that you'll reach those figures.
Well, it is an ambitious change. It's an ambitious budget, and this is an ambitious government. And we couldn't sit by and let the NDIS costs blow out to the extent that they were. Spending will still grow, but much more slowly. I pay tribute to Mark Butler and Jenny McAllister and the other colleagues for the work that has gone into this. This is a really important part of the savings package, but more than that, it's a key economic reform. The way this budget has been interpreted is that tax reform is a big part of it. It is. Productivity package, big reform, it is. But also in the NDIS and in budget sustainability, there's a number of important reforms there too.
We're also sitting on Australia's weakest productivity growth in 60 years, I think. 2 terms, 5 budgets. That's on you, isn't it?
Well, hang on a minute. The weakest decade for productivity growth in the last 60 years was the coalition decade. In the last year, we've seen things turn around in welcome ways. In the market sector, 1.5%, overall 1%, that's higher than the 20-year average, but it's not enough to deliver the higher living standards that we want to see for more of our people and lift the speed limit in our economy. So there's a very broad and ambitious productivity package in this budget to grow the economy and lift living standards and wages over time.
I just want to loop back to the idea of promises and integrity. Do you accept that even if these changes are very well received amongst young voters, no one will believe a promise from this government ever again?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think that the most important thing, genuinely, is if we come to a different view, we explain why. And the most important thing beyond that...
Wouldn't it help if you acknowledge that these were broken promises? It's such a simple formulation that you keep avoiding.
Well, I don't think I have. I mean, I've taken responsibility for the fact that the government has a different view now than it had 12 months ago. I do take responsibility for that. And that's because I've come to a different view on these policy changes. I'm explaining why. But more important than any of that, let's not lose sight of the actual issue that we are addressing here. Now, the easiest thing in the world would have been for me to sit here and rationalise to you why we hadn't made any of these changes. That would have been so much easier than explaining why we have, but it wouldn't have been the right outcome. For 75,000 Australians who would stay locked out of the housing market, it wouldn't have been the right outcome for workers who continue to be treated in an inferior way to people who make their income in other ways legitimately in our economy. And so I'd rather make the difficult decision and explain why than take the easy decision and escape some of these questions.
Treasurer, congratulations again on your 5th budget, and thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. The signature reform tonight was the widely expected changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax, changes the government says will make housing more accessible to younger Australians. Here's economics reporter Tom Crowley.
Surprise, after endless speculation, we thought we knew what was going to be in this budget, and we were in the right postcode, but there's a lot we didn't expect. Let's start with negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount. No surprise to see this has been reined in. It has long been in Labor's sights. And if you want to know why, just look what happened when John Howard made the capital gains tax discount more generous way back in 1999. Rental losses exploded, not because landlords were doing badly, but because all of this could come off your tax bill. And then when you sell up, you could make it all back and then some. Treasury says 1 in every 3 people paid less tax than if they'd never owned a rental. Tonight, the government is declaring time on all of that, literally. If you have a property already, you can keep negative gearing it. But for future purchases, you can't use it to write down your wage income unless you invest in a new build. Any capital gains you've already made, keep the old discount. But for any new gains, the clock starts ticking from next year. And that's true even for homes bought before 1985, which until tonight were not subject to capital gains tax at all. From next July, that changes. A grandparent who's held onto an old home for decades and is now renting it out will start accumulating a tax liability for the first time. All of this means some investors will probably decide to sell up. But that's exactly what Labor wants. They say the policy will create 75,000 new homeowners over a decade, reversing the last decade of ownership decline. But every one of those new homeowners buys from an investor that has been chased out of the market by higher taxes. That's the trade-off at the heart of this policy. Labor could have created more winners if it hadn't grandfathered, but it would have created an equal number of losers. Now, there's even more in this budget that we didn't expect. This does not just apply to properties, it applies to shares as well. But to make up for that, there are new incentives for businesses who take on risk, especially startups. There will also be a 30% minimum tax on discretionary trusts, which Labor is arguing are the preserve of the wealthy, who do get most of the benefit. And some of the money will come back to workers in the form of a permanent tax offset of up to $250, but only for wages, not for investment income. That's the message of this budget. It's a declaration that the tax system is too generous to passive earners and too harsh on wage earners. Will that change? Not entirely, and less so thanks to all of that grandfathering. But this will reshape the tax system. That is, if it survives the fierce debate to come. The starter's gun on that has just been fired.
For the opposition's first response to the government's big economic blueprint, Shadow Treasurer Tim Wilson joins me. Welcome, Tim Wilson. Now, when we were talking just a moment ago, you said you thought this budget was weird. What do you mean?
Well, at the end of the day, the government has put forward a budget that's about broken promises, higher taxes, lower living standards, and fewer homes. We set 3 basic tests for this budget, which was to restore standard of livings. The reality is standard of livings are going backward under this government. Real wages have gone back by 3% over the life of this government. We set the test around building Australia's security. It has less spending on defence, from 2.1 to 2% of GDP. And we set a test that was fundamentally about making sure that we saw a better outcome for Australians and honesty in the budget. And the problem is there has only been 1 point of honesty that we've seen in this budget, which is we have seen 35,000 fewer homes being built over a decade and higher rents.
When you talk about honesty, do you need to read that off your notes?
No, there's just a lot of numbers in this context at the moment, Sarah. And the reality is we're seeing fewer homes being built, 35,000 of them being built over the decade, while we're seeing an increase in the overall number of people who are arriving under migration.
house prices have grown 400% in 25 years. That's the figure that the Treasurer used in his speech. Do you accept that the government has to pull all levers in a crisis of that magnitude?
I don't accept that the government should be doing things on the basis of broken trust, and that's the problem with what this budget
But do you accept that there is a crisis for young people getting access to ownership?
There is a challenge around young Australians being able to buy their own home. The solution that the government is putting forward is to build fewer homes based on their own data and to see an increase in rent.
I refer people to the Treasurer's interview just now, who made a case about it being the whole of the housing policy have to be seen in a whole. But just to correct you slightly on that, but that's available to people. The Treasurer says that tax changes will deliver housing. Are you able to look young people in the face and say, I deny you that opportunity. I don't want to see these changes to the tax code that has had such a deleterious effect on access to housing?
But that's simply not a reasonable proposition forward. The government has put in its own budget documents they're going to build 35,000 fewer homes over the life of this budget. They're going to increase the price of rents on young Australians. And when you look through the other measures they're introducing, including capital gains tax, if you seek to invest your home deposit to buy your first home, the government is going to increase the taxes on that. So they're actually kneecapping young Australians who want to get ahead, save for their future and be in a better position to buy their own home.
So let's be very clear about this. Would you support any of the measures that the Treasurer has put forward this evening in relation to housing access?
Well, they're not propositions on improving housing access. What they're putting forward is new taxes on Australians, whether it's through capital gains, through trusts or negative gearing. And we won't be supporting those because by the government's own admission, it will lead to fewer homes being built for young Australians to be able to get into the property market and increase the price of rents, while also, on their own projections, overshooting the number of people who are coming in a migration program.
So to be clear, categorically, you will not support any of these measures?
We won't be supporting these measures because it fundamentally undermines the pathway for young Australians on their own data to be able to buy their first home.
Now, also presented tonight, 13 million workers will receive a $250 tax cut with the Working Australians tax offset, which they receive in 2028. Do you support it?
So we do support this measure because ultimately Australians need to be able to be protected from the consequences of Jim Chalmers' active inflation agenda. But let's be realistic. Every time the government puts forward a measure like that, it's outstripped by inflation. The tax cuts they gave at the last election were stripped out by December. The tax cuts that are being proposed by this government will ultimately be stripped out by the end of this year. So until they get their spending under control and stop inflation, Australians will continue to be worse off.
You've accepted that there is something of a crisis of access to housing for young people. So what have you got on offer to combat what the government is putting forward now?
Well, the Leader of the Opposition, Angus Taylor, has already flagged that we'll be announcing a series of budgets in our measures in the budget on Thursday night, and particularly around tying a relationship between building of construction and, of course, migration, which is in direct opposite to what this government is offering, which is 35,000 fewer homes while concurrently overshooting their own migration forecasts.
Do you support targeting negative gearing in its present form, or should it stay exactly as it functions at the moment?
Well, we won't be supporting the proposed changes.
Sure, but what about negative gearing more broadly? Do you think it should stay untouched? Is that your message to young people in Australia tonight?
Well, it's simply dishonest to correlate it to housing construction in the way the government's seeking to, except that it leads to fewer houses being constructed by their own budget documents, 35,000 new homes being built over a decade as a consequence of the changes they're being put forward. And it will lead to high rents. The government's own documents admit that. So if we're being honest about the budget circumstances, we need to acknowledge that there is a real and direct consequence of the proposal they're putting forward.
How do you think your constituents tonight will feel looking at you, your younger constituents looking at you tonight? Do you think that that's what they want to hear from you, that there should be no tinkering with these tax settings at all?
Well, I think what they want is to be able to get ahead, to put themselves in a position to save for a deposit, to be able to buy their own home. And we know that supply is an essential part of this of increasing housing availability. Instead, what the government has done tonight is broken a series of promises, so there's no trust left with this government anymore. And in addition to that, they're going to build 35,000 fewer homes while increasing rents and taxing first home deposits if they're invested.
Tim Wilson, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, Ian Verinder is the ABC's chief business correspondent. He joins me from Sydney. Ian, as we heard there from Tim Wilson, the government has clearly picked a fight on its changes to CGT and negative gearing. So why is the government doing this now, and will it work?
Well, Sarah, politics and economics are just welded together. And what we've seen across the developed world in the last few years is a flight of voters from the centre to the extremes, the left and the right. And we saw it on the weekend in Australia as well. It's happening here. Now, in Europe and the US, it's been largely the result of globalisation and changes to industry and the workforce. But here, I think there's a palpable sense of disenchantment amongst particularly younger voters who think that they've been locked out of the system, that the economy offers them really very little. They've got no chance of ever buying a home. And they see that the tax incentives that have been in place for the past 25 years have essentially driven prices well beyond their reach.
Now, of course, delivery here, Ian, is incredibly important. We are talking about a series of propositions that are broken promises from the Prime Minister before the election. So seeing this policy work is incredibly important to the credibility of this government for its remaining time in office. Is it your assessment that these changes will make a fundamental difference to access for young people to housing?
Not immediately, no. I mean, this is going to be a very long and drawn-out process. I mean, the government's own estimates are that prices will be around about 2% lower than they otherwise would have been. Some in the industry say around about 1 to 4%. But I think if you look at just the numbers themselves, Treasury estimates that about $13.5 billion in revenue has been foregone because of these tax incentives, and the clawback from the changes tonight will bring back about $3 billion of that. So that's because of the grandfathering, but it gives you an indication of just how long this is going to take to try and unwind this situation.
Ian, thank you very much indeed for your analysis tonight. We'll look forward to reading and hearing more from you in the days ahead. And that's the programme for this evening. Our budget coverage continues now with a special edition of Insiders with my colleague David Spears. Thank you very much indeed for joining us for this part. Good night.
Sarah, good evening and welcome to a special budget night edition of Insiders. I'm David Spears. Well, we've heard the Treasurer make his pitch there about this being the most ambitious budget in decades. We've heard the Shadow Treasurer laying out the opposition's concerns and the elements it will vote against. So how does this budget stack up for you and the nation? Coming up, we'll bring you the economic and political verdict from independent economists and budget watchers. Chris Richardson and Aruna Sathnapalli. Our political analysts will join us a little later. Patricia Carvelis, Jacob Grieber and Melissa Clark on how the battle lines are already being drawn tonight, and some of the independents and minor parties who will have to vote either for or against these changes. This budget certainly comes against a complicated backdrop, an unresolved war in the Middle East, creating enormous uncertainty and volatility, a budget that's in need of repair, and a domestic political landscape in flux, underscored by One Nation's by-election win on the weekend. The government has judged that this is the moment to be bold. In the second year of its second term, sitting on a big majority, it's time to take some risks. And the main story tonight is this overhaul of negative gearing, capital gains tax and trusts. So to recap, from July next year, negative gearing will be limited to newly built homes only. Existing investments will be grandfathered. The flat 50% capital gains tax discount will also go from mid-next year for all investments, that's property and shares. Instead, capital gains tax will return to the Keating-era model of taxing the real gain after inflation. And then a 30% minimum tax will apply to avoid any tax avoidance. The big revenue crackdown is on discretionary trusts. They're mainly held by wealthier Australians. This won't kick in until July 2028, so it allows some time for affairs to be rearranged. From that point, a minimum 30% tax rate will apply to income distributed from trusts, with exemptions for farmers and charitable trusts. And what's the government going to be giving back as a result of all of this? Well, all workers will receive a new tax offset of up to $250 each year from mid-2028. All this is being sold as a reform to rebalance the tax system, taxing assets more, income less, shifting the benefits from the investor class to the working class. But all up, these changes will also boost the government's tax take quite significantly by more than $77 billion over the coming decade, in fact, which should help repair the budget bottom line. The budget will remain in deficit over the next 4 years, with an eventual return to surplus finally appearing on the distant horizon, not for another 9 years. That is a long way off and anything could happen, but the government needs that line you're looking at pointing in the right direction, and it finally is. Most of the heavy lifting, though, on this budget repair isn't on the tax side, it's on the spending side. Take a look at the major savings. This one we knew about, the big one, the NDIS. It's forecast to save the Commonwealth, we find out tonight, a whopping $152 billion over the decade, the changes they've announced. Removing the less generous private health insurance rebate for over 65s, that's saving $11 billion over the decade. And there's a small saving too from curbing spending on green schemes like the Solar Sunshot and Hydrogen Head Starts scheme. So all up, yes, there is ambition here. Taking on investors is not without risk, particularly when Labor ruled out some of these changes at the election only 12 months ago. And yes, there is budget repair here too, and it's relying heavily on changes to the NDIS, which are still being worked through. But is there enough being done here, given the global uncertainties Australia is facing? Let's bring in renowned budget watchers, Chris Richardson from Rich Insight and Aruna Sathanapalli, CEO of the Grattan Institute. Great to see you both. Great to spend the day with you in the budget lockup. Chris, let me start with you. There is budget repair here. How much of this is good management? How much of it is good luck on the government's part?
Well, there is a lot to like in this budget, and you've gone through those big changes, much courage there, but you look at the biggest dollar difference that the government is saying very happily, much smaller deficits over the next 5 years. They're down $45 billion. But that's not due to all these policy changes we're talking about. It's due to an old thing. There is a revenue windfall, essentially the combination of war and inflation, those two things acting to give the taxman a bigger bucket of money to tax. You know, the world is paying us more for some of our exports. Inflation, again, adds to the size of the bucket. That makes up more than 9 out of every $10 in budget repair between here and the end of the decade.
That's a lot.
It is most of it, far and away. The big differences from these policy changes, they sit further out in time.
And that war, that benefit from the war to the budget at least, there for the next 4 years, but then it turns negative, is that right, beyond that?
Basically, there is a near-term boost to the tax take from that combination of war and inflation. But yeah, it is big bucks, close to $20 billion next year. One thing to watch, though, is spending has also crept up next year. The Reserve Bank, keeping an eye on things like what are the states doing, Western Australia, Victoria. They'll be keeping a bit of an eye on next year's
until
spend.
those NDIS savings kick in. That spending
we
creeps
get
up.
there eventually.
Now the tax changes, Aruna, you have long championed reforms to negative gearing, capital gains tax. You gave the keynote speech at that economic reform roundtable the Treasurer held last year, all about this. What do you make of where he's landed?
Yeah, so look, the road to this budget started at that reform roundtable, and we spent a lot of time in the cabinet room talking about the biggest opportunity, which was rebalancing the tax system, and that's exactly what's come through here. So the budget does actually take major strides towards dealing with something that's been in the too hard basket. It's a budget we've been waiting for quite some time. There's a reason we've talked about this stuff over and over again for a decade. It's because the case is really clear that the settings have led to a bunch of perverse incentives and some pretty unprincipled outcomes. And so, look, I think that the steps, the steps on negative gearing and discretionary trusts are fully in line with Grattan recommendations. The CGT recommendation, the CGT reform is, I think, a clever way of dealing with the fundamental issue, which is people gaming the capital gains tax system to effectively avoid tax through tax planning. And that's really what you don't want your tax system doing. You don't want your tax system distorting people's behaviour, leading to them to invest in places they wouldn't invest, or to time their affairs purely to avoid a tax.
I mean, there's a lot of people who do take advantage of capital gains tax, negative gearing and trusts, but there was an interesting graph in the budget, buried in the budget papers at Runa, that you pointed out to me, and it shows where the actual bulk of the wealth is going here.
Yeah, so this is the thing. While these tax concessions loom large in our public imagination, but when you actually look at the numbers, the use of them is astonishingly concentrated. And so the budget papers dive into the ATO data and show that about a third of capital gains go to people who are the top 1% of Australian earners over their lifetimes.
Of the benefit going to 1%.
And over half of the gains go to the highest 10%. Right. And then when you come to trusts, I think people may have seen the chart earlier, but like only 5% of Australians really receive income through these discretionary trusts. And they're really concentrated in the wealthiest 10% of households. So actually, this is a relatively small slice of Australians, but the tax concessions have been very, very generous, and we've seen use of them grow over time. So if we don't nip this in the bud now, the problem only gets worse every year. We're going
to talk with our political analyst later about the politics of that, because you're right, it's concentrated at the top, but there might still be a lot of people worried about it. Chris, what do you make of these tax changes and the concern that was there leading up to tonight about what this might mean for startups and venture capital and small business trying to get off the ground? Will they suffer because of these or not?
And there's been a big and loud recent campaign. So worth noting, yes, this change in capital gains tax is rough if you've made big bucks with your startup. What has the government done in response? Well, you don't want to discourage people from taking risk, but they haven't held on to a capital gains tax discount as a way to address that. Our capital gains tax discount is a terrible way to help startups. They're doing a bunch of other things, and in particular, they're doing things early in the life of new ventures, new startups, and so on, where cash is most important.
And we haven't really talked a lot about that tonight, but this is another part of.
That's right.
A separate piece of tax reform, really, there, Aruna.
Yeah, and look, we shouldn't lose sight of this, that, there's two sides of the puzzle. We don't want money going into unproductive investment. We do want productive business investment, right? Like, at the core of this budget is also a productivity package. I know that it might not seem, the deregulatory agenda might not seem as exciting as some of the tax changes, but I think they've really gotten into the drawer of all of the things that have been long listed as the things that will enable Australian businesses to flourish.
Was that a lot of the bits and pieces at the economic roundtable that were discussed?
Exactly. So this has come through that process. It's the measures are set out. A lot of them are a grind. A lot of them require working with the states and territories, but they're absolutely the things you need to be doing to make it easier to start up businesses. But then, as Chris says, there's also a piece around setting up your tax incentives or your other incentives to get investment in young, high-growth businesses. Your capital gains tax mechanism, when people cash out, that's not your best way to do it. There are other ways to do that, and we're starting to see that in this budget.
Back to the spending. Bottom line here, Chris, we know the Reserve Bank Governor just last week, when rates went up, gave a very clear warning, don't put too much stimulus in. This is only going to make our job more difficult. Will the Reserve Bank be happy or grumpy looking at this tonight?
They're going to be happy that the government didn't do the big cost of living package. It didn't announce an extension, for example, of that fuel tax cut. That is great. But there is still a bunch of extra money extra cash going into the economy as government spending in the near term. Next year's government spend had been forecast to increase 3.1%, now going to go up 5.3%, and the states have been a big part of the problem too. So the Reserve Bank will be having a close look. Their eyebrows will be raised. I don't think you would say governments are a huge part of the continuing problem, but they're not yet a part of the solution.
Okay, that's interesting. In terms of whether the forecasts about the war coming to an end and the oil price coming down are too rosy, What do you think, Aruna?
So, look, this central budget scenario is similar to the Reserve Bank, based on a universe where the war comes to an end fairly swiftly and we start to see oil prices normalise. Now, that is something we do not know, and Australia certainly can't control. So we'll need to see what the next 6 months hold. The Treasury has prepared a severe scenario where you see what happens if oil prices remain elevated, unemployment rises up higher, and inflation is, hitting those levels that we saw after COVID. Now, if that happens, there is going to be more pressure on governments to do something to respond. But I think, I'm certainly happy to see that they haven't surged to that in this budget and have cracked on and done the long-term reform that actually builds that resilience.
Long-term reform, just final word, Chris, we heard the Treasurer talking up, and the Prime Minister will be as well, the scale of reform here. Most ambitious in decades. You've watched a lot of budgets. Where does this one sit?
There have been a lot of changes, and the to-do list, in the top drawer of the Productivity Commission and Treasury, a chunk of those things have been done. But that's not how history will judge this. Not enough has been done on the grind, on the detail for 2 decades. Everything from gas taxes to the WA GST deal to cigarette taxes. There are big disaster areas remaining in the budget. We can and should do better.
All right, we'll see where they go in the next budget or two, but appreciate both of you joining us tonight for your analysis on this pretty important one. Appreciate that. Well, by far, as we discussed, the biggest saving in this budget is that overhaul of the NDIS. The government is banking a $36 billion saving over 4 years and far more over the decade. The credibility of this whole budget really rests on whether these NDIS savings can be achieved. Naz Campanella is the ABC's Disability Affairs reporter and joins me now. Naz, thanks for your time. Look, we know these changes were announced a few weeks ago by the Minister Mark Butler, but many of the details are still to be worked through. Has tonight's budget shed any more light on how these changes are going to look?
Look, in short, the budget tonight has really raised more questions than provided answers. We know that $10 billion will be spent over 10 years on services, or the re-establishment of services outside the NDIS. So many of the state and territory run services when the NDIS began shut their doors. And so this money will be spent re-establishing those, something many have talked about for a very long time. We're talking about $4 billion over that decade to be spent on Thriving Kids, a program for children under 8 with developmental delay and autism, and then $6 billion for other services outside the scheme. Now, people were really hoping for some detail about how that money would be spent, where it would go, exactly how the states and territories would be using it. We haven't got that detail tonight, but establishing those services, particularly in light of the reforms that have already been announced, for example, changes to eligibility, diverting about 160,000 participants off the scheme, tightening registration for providers and cracking down on fraud. All of those reforms are expected to provide a saving of $36.2 billion in the next 4 years, and by the end of the decade, that's expected to then result in the NDIS costing $56 billion.
And the timeframes here are critical, aren't they, to achieve this and to get that growth rate of the NDIS from around 10% down to an average 2% over the next 4 years. You touch on the various things that need to be done, the eligibility rules, the decisions around registering more providers and so on. Can this be done in the time frame that they're aiming for here?
Look, I've heard the word bandied around a lot, ambitious. This is really ambitious, and of all the conversations I've been having in recent times across the sector, everyone is saying that conversations need to start with, continue with the states and territories about what these services will look like, and the work to actually begin immediately, because it is going to take a long time to rebuild the system, but that it can't just be rebuilt. We can't have a carbon copy, many say, of what we had before, because the reality was that was a broken system that led to the NDIS needing to be established in the first place. So to ensure that the system is better than what the sector had before. That work really needs to start ASAP.
Yeah, Naz, and we know from your reporting that many families, of course, are quite anxious through this process, waiting to see that detail, and it doesn't sound like tonight's budget necessarily will resolve or ease any of that anxiety. Really appreciate you joining us, Naz. Thanks so much for that.
Thank you.
Well, as the weekend by-election reminded us, Australian politics is no longer a contest between just two major parties. Independents, the Greens and One Nation are all shaping the debate. Now, we don't have time to talk to them all tonight, but we are going to hear from some of them briefly. Allegra Spender is the independent member for Wentworth, who's been heavily focused on tax reform, having released her own tax white paper just in March. Thank you for your time. Look, in particular, negative gearing, capital gains tax, you've been calling for reform on these for some time. What do you make of where the government's landed?
So I think overall I've wanted to see ambitious tax reform in this budget, and certainly there is a significant amount of tax reform. In terms of negative gearing, I think it's absolutely appropriate. I think in terms of trusts, again, this is areas that I think I really support. And I do support reducing capital gains tax discounts, but I think there's some genuinely legitimate concerns from particularly founders and early stage ventures who are asking, how this might affect those groups. So I think the particular structure that they've looked at in CGT is the one that I really need to go back to the sort of business and funds community and say, look, what's your perspective on these, particularly in relation to early stage ventures, which are so important?
Okay, so that's an important point of clarification you'll be seeking about the impact on those founders and startups. Trusts, though, it sounds like you are comfortable, because this is the one doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of extra revenue here in this package. A 30% minimum tax on distributions from trusts. How do you feel about that? How will people in your electorate feel about that?
Well, I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of feedback on this in particular, but I think the principle really here, I think, should be that, we're trying to have a tax system that I think is both horizontally and vertically fair. Like, if you earn a similar amount of money, you should pay a similar amount of tax. Now, capital's a little bit different because there's, it's for a variety of reasons, but if you are earning money through trusts and you're distributing it, the sort of sense is that, you should be, you shouldn't be advantaged compared to a wage earner. So I think that it is appropriate to put I see that it is appropriate to put some minimum around trust distributions. I think a key part of this debate that we should be having, though, is also how to make sure that any tax cuts or tax increases are returned in terms of
Well, I was going to ask you this, because you've also argued that whatever's done on investment taxes should be returned to help workers in lowering income tax. Now, there's this tax offset for working Australians. It'll be $250 a year from mid-2028. Is that what you were after, or do you think more of this should be returned?
Look, I think from what I can tell from the budget papers, a lot of the sort of tax changes are going to hit more in the sort of medium to longer term. We've estimated that around $77 billion worth of the sort of tax implications of these changes will, the tax raised in these areas is going to hit in that sort of medium longer term, outside of the provision the government's already talked about. So I think that is the space where I really want to see the government commit to reducing taxes on income, because I think we do need to lower the taxes on income, particularly working income, or otherwise people can't get ahead. And I think that's absolutely critical when we're talking about young people.
Allegra Spender, thanks for joining us for your immediate take on the budget. Appreciate that. We heard earlier from the opposition, Tim Wilson, saying they're going to oppose these tax changes. That means the government will have to look to the Greens to pass these changes through the Senate. The Greens leader, Larissa Waters, joins me now. Senator, thank you for your time. We know the Greens have been calling for some of these tax changes. Will you support what the government's announced tonight?
Well, David, the Greens have been trying to fix the housing crisis for many, many decades under these terrible property investor tax perks, and we needed to see real reform tonight. Australians deserve that. But what they've seen instead is tinkering. On our calculations, this budget keeps in place 95% of those property investor tax perks, and it does nothing for renters. So this was a real opportunity for the government to actually step up and help people, and instead they've delivered a budget that simply feathers the nest of wealthy corporations and the 1%, and we think won't fix the housing crisis.
So to be clear, on the negative gearing, are you saying there should be no grandfathering of existing investments?
Yeah, well, we'll take a look at the detail once the legislation comes out, David, but the fact that they've grandfathered in the existing unfair tax settings simply means that they're baking that inequality in. And if this is a small step forward, well, that'll factor into our decision making, but this is a real missed opportunity to actually seriously address the housing crisis.
Now, we've seen this before where it might not be everything the Greens want, but would you seriously vote against these changes?
Well, as I've said, David, we'll see what is actually in the legislation, and if it's a small step forward, well, that'll factor into what we decide to do. But I think with this budget, the key point is this is a budget that delivers for big corporations and the wealthy 1%. It's cutting 160,000 people off disability support, off the NDIS, and yet they've found $53 billion for war and for weapons to appease Donald Trump. They could have raised revenue from the obscene profiteering big corporations. They've let the gas corporations get off scot-free.
Just let me ask you that, because we know you've been campaigning for this tax on gas exports. Would you horse trade here and say you'll only get our vote on negative gearing, capital gains tax, trusts if you do the gas tax?
Well, we have been pushing for a gas tax. The government could have raised $17 billion every year for real cost of living relief. Instead, they've come up with $4.81 for workers that doesn't kick in for 2 more years. They have squibbed the opportunity to raise revenue from the profiteering big corporations and the 1%. And now they've got the hide to try to call this ambitious. Well, it'll be working very well for the haves, and it will leave ordinary Australians behind.
In terms of the haves, the have-not, this $250 annual working Australians tax offset goes to people obviously working, but what about those who don't have a job? Are you, and the fact that this is not means tested either, would you like to see any changes in relation to that tax break?
Well, I think a $4.81 a week, not for another 2 years, is not going to help people with the current cost of living crisis. And there's nothing in here that will increase income support for people who are looking for work. There's nothing in here that increases the support to people who aren't in the workforce. We're all in this cost of living crisis, and yet the government's not helping the people that most deserve the help. And now it's trying to sell $4.80 in 2 years' time as some big fix, while letting the gas corporations get off scot-free and not tackling that corporate profiteering that is seeing inflation rise and causing pain on ordinary people. The priorities are very clear. They're here for the 1%. They're not here for people.
Greens leader Larissa Waters, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks, David.
And for his reaction to this budget that's just been delivered tonight, let's go to One Nation MP Barnaby Joyce joining us this evening. Barnaby Joyce, thanks for your time. Let's start on the tax changes, negative gearing, capital gains tax, trusts. What do you think of what the government's announced tonight?
I think they're destroying the inspiration of people who are entrepreneurial. David, anybody who takes a risk to build up a business, who starts from nothing, works on the premise that one of the great fruits of their labour is that later on they sell that business, they sell that entrepreneurship for a substantial capital gain. What we're saying is, well, you know, we will tax you at 47%, minimum 30% on that capital gain. And so what they do for the really smart ones, for the smart ones who are smart enough to develop a new form of energy, smart enough to develop a new form of computer program, smart enough to develop a new form of motor car, whatever you like, then the smartest thing for them to do is leave Australia and go to Singapore or go to the United States, where they actually attract entrepreneurship, not smash entrepreneurship. As far as you go with houses, this fallacy that there are a whole range of people out there who are only renting because they wanted to. They were actually undercover first home buyers, and they were just renting because they wanted to. And now that we've brought in this change, they'll all just become first home buyers. No, they won't. They'll continue renting, and they'll get pushed down the scale and out of the rental market and onto the street. Paul Keating had a crack at this and 2 years later he had to reverse it because you're getting homelessness.
Well, the government does argue this will help 75,000 people into homes for the first time. And it says part of the reason it's doing this is because there's this frustration amongst so many, particularly younger Australians, that the system's not working for them, it's working against them, that they can't crack into the market. And that this is part of the reason why we saw people vote One Nation too, because they just don't think the system is working for them. Are you saying the status quo is working on these investment taxes?
I'm saying that you just can't do anything and say that's better than the status quo, because you might be doing something worse. If they said, look, what we're going to do from now on is hop around the living room because, we just can't go with the status quo. You could say, well, you can hop around the living room, but it doesn't change anything.
So how do you help people get into the housing market who are stuck renting?
Well, first of all, you start with the regulatory side of it. You have so many people. If you look to try and build a house, have a look at how much tens of thousands of dollars you spend before you can even get a spade in the ground. You have to have a look at immigration policy, of course. You can't keep bringing people in at such a rate as there's not the housing stock to absorb them. It's simple supply and demand. The prices of houses go up and beyond the capacity of Australians to buy.
But
everybody knows that.
On these changes, though, just finally here, do you accept there is a problem with the tax system being too favourably weighted towards investors rather than income-earning workers?
Well, what you have here is the point of a good management. If you have a look at Singapore, here is an island at the end of the Malaysian peninsula with no oil, no gas, no iron ore, no copper, no bauxite, no gold, no cattle, no sheep, no irrigation.
But
it has a GDP that is a third to a quarter the size of Australia's because its resources between its ears. It attracts entrepreneurship.
Okay, coming back
and what we're doing here
to the
is
tax
saying
system
we
here.
don't believe in it.
But are you saying that the system at the moment is okay, that it's not too heavily weighted towards those with assets rather than those who don't have assets?
Look, I think people who have assets have paid for them out of post-tax profit, post-tax money. They've already paid tax.
Or inherited.
And in a frugal way, and I'm sure you are as well, they put money aside for a rainy day in an asset, and now the government's saying, no, you would be better just paying it up against the wall because Uncle Jimmy's going to take it in any case. So don't put away for a rainy day. Don't try and invest in something. Just whoop it up. Go overseas, buy a new boat, buy a new house, buy a new car. You don't need to save, because if you do save, Uncle Jim's going to take 50% of it.
All right, Barnaby Joyce, appreciate you joining us with your take on the budget this evening. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Let's bring in our political panel now. Melissa Clark, Jacob Grieber and Patricia Karvelis. A very good evening to all of you. A bit to explore here. Let's start with the Treasurer selling this as the most ambitious budget in decades. Mel, is it?
I think it is. I've been stretching my mind for an analogy to try and put this in context a bit, and I seem to have come up with Alexander Hamilton and Tony Abbott.
Okay.
So this is a bit Alexander Hamilton. Right. I'm not throwing away my shot. This is Jim Chalmers seeing a political opportunity to make change. We're at a time when they have strong public support from an election result, pathways they can work through in the Senate, and a bit of a runway before they need to go back to a general election. This is Jim Chalmers taking his shot to make a legacy, to make a reform, to do something that he can hang his hat on and say, I did something with the political capital I've got. So that's the Alexander Hamilton part. The Tony Abbott part, you might remember a little saying of sometimes it's better to seek forgiveness than ask permission. And I think there's a little bit of that from this Labor government here. They didn't take this to an election, but they are making the change and they are asking the electorate for forgiveness as they try and explain why they're doing it.
I think Mel will get the points for the first Hamilton reference on a budget night.
Well, if you're watching Budget Night, I'm pretty sure maybe Alexander Hamilton, a bit of a musical, you might be into it.
Well, Mel touches on what's going to be the big political question here that we're all going to be grappling with and seeing how this plays out, Jacob, and that is breaking a promise, an election promise only 12 months ago, going to be the negative of that, going to be outweighed by those cheering someone taking on real reform?
Yeah, let's see how committed the people are who are saying to the government and have been saying to the government, when are you going to spend your political capital? Now they're spending it. Some of those folks may not like what's happening. Some of those folks may now be about to be paying more on any wealth they've accumulated. It is something you hear from baby boomers. On the one hand, they say, we want government to be bold. We're worried about housing. We're worried about whether our kids will be able to live in our neighbourhoods. But the government's going to tap those folks quite a bit, actually. You mentioned it earlier in the coverage. The tax take from reforms to CGT, trust, some of those things are big dollars, not immediately, but in a few years.
Not all of it's going back into workers. I mean, a little bit is.
No, it's certainly not. And actually the compensation to workers, the sort of the trade-off, I guess, if you like, is really quite modest. It's from 27, 28 onwards.
Unless there's a pre-election tax cut
we can talk about that, but sure. To your question, though, This is now the test of, can you do difficult things without a direct mandate from people? Just a vague, you won 94 seats, which is big, but now they're doing specifics. They didn't take these changes to the last election.
PK, the opposition, we've been asking them this question for weeks, haven't we? Will you vote against? And we've got a sort of a non-answer until tonight. They very quickly said, we're going to vote against.
They have made it clear, Tim Wilson made it clear to Sarah Ferguson, our colleague, that all of the measures will be opposed by the coalition. So you've actually got, really truthfully, a very traditional Labor-Liberal fight over... it's a class war. I mean, someone's got to call it for what it is. We call it an intergenerational war. I think that's not really reflective of what it really is. If you look at the tax changes on trusts, for instance, it will affect the top 1% in this country. Now, Tim Wilson has essentially declared that they will vote against that change. Clearly, though, some of those people will be coalition voters. There's no doubt about it. But if you look at the electoral roll, right, because there's a lot of politics in budgets, they can pretend that it's all about the economy, stupid, it's actually about voters. If you look at the electoral roll, it's Zoomers, Gen Z and millennials that are increasingly taking up a huge, part of that
Well, this is
pie.
the thing. So Aruna was making the point earlier, the benefit goes, a third of the benefit goes to the top 1%. But there's a long tail of people who aren't getting a huge benefit but are still taking some advantage of these rules. How does that play?
Well, there's a risk, versus reward thing with everything you do. This has got risks, and we've seen it play out before. There'll be a huge scare campaign as a result of this. The government's prepared for it. You can see them, though. This isn't pitched to us. This is pitched to those young voters. I mean, my daughter will vote at the next election, for crying out loud. It is about them. They have been pumping out vertical videos for this generation all afternoon. They are trying to flood their streams. They are trying to convince them that the government is on their side, and they figure those guys outnumber the boomers and the part of Gen X that is affected by this.
Where's the pressure going to be for the government? Who are the losers beyond the richy rich? Are there going to be genuine concerns here for the government about some who will be worse off?
Well, I think the political contest is really going to come down to the very squarely middle-class income earners, because the coalition isn't going to go into this fight saying we want to protect the 1% who benefit most from taxes. They're going to say we want young people today to have the same opportunities to benefit from these kind of tax concessions that older Australians have had. And if you might not have an investment property now, but maybe you're getting close, or maybe you think you will get to that point and you'd like to have the same tax concessions, they'll point to this as the aspiration of the middle class being tackled, whereas Labor will say, no, it's precisely the middle class, not just the children, but the parents of the children who are worried about their ability to get into.
It is a hard argument.
When
these people can't even buy the house
Yes.
to live in the house,
let alone
those amazing investment properties they're looking forward to getting when they can't actually buy their own house. This is the fundamental problem.
And the point the opposition's also making tonight, Jacob, is that the tax changes do actually dampen or lower supply of housing a bit. That's made up for with other spending the government's trying to get housing going.
That's that 35,000 house reduction that the Treasury modelling has spat out, if you like. A lot of this stuff is very, very hard to know for certain, because we're talking about incentive changes. That means behavioural changes. You're making guesses here, but the government's argument is they're doing other things that will increase supply, including, in fact, an idea that the coalition government took to the last election, which is to remove some of the infrastructure barriers to getting more houses built. But just to go back on it's 1% that's affected by trusts or some of these other changes. I think it's in number terms of people affected, I think it's much larger than that. Trusts is 1 million people. Certainly CGD is a lot more than that, as is negative gearing. So while the top collects the benefit, because they have bigger investments, the dollar amounts look larger there. That's maths. But in terms of numbers of people affected, and then the coalition's point will be the people who are aspiring to climb that ladder will be saying, nice to see you, boomers, as the cruise ship departs the dock and the big deck goes up and they disappear with all the benefits that they got.
I want to come back to you guys and get some thoughts, some final thoughts, including on productivity. I know it's often not the sexiest, but does this budget do much to
Spice yourself
improve
up, David.
productivity? I'll come back. Now, for a look at what this budget means for small business, though, here's David Chow.
The government says one of its many priorities in this budget is to help small businesses grow, innovate and be more productive. Some of these sweeteners are recycled ideas though. For instance, the instant asset write-off is now permanent and the requirements to take advantage of it are not very demanding at all. As long as your small business turnover is less than $10 million, which is a lot of them, you can immediately deduct assets costing less than $20,000, like laptops, utes, basically anything, instead of depreciating them over several years. The government says this will result in tax revenue falling by $890 million over 5 years. There are also some new budget sweeteners though, like this thing called loss refundability. Basically, its aim is to boost business cash flow, and how it works is this. Companies with turnover of $1 billion or less, which is nearly all of them, will be able to use their current year tax losses to get a refund for the tax they paid in the previous 2 financial years, which takes effect from July this year. And there's something in it for small startup founders as well. From the 2028-29 financial year, small startups in their first 2 years of trading can get a refund for their tax losses, up to the amount they pay in fringe benefits tax and withholding tax paid on employee wages. Given there's a high failure rate for startups, this measure will probably keep a few of them afloat. Something else for businesses to be careful about, the government wants to give more powers to the competition regulator, the ACCC, and wants to double the maximum fines for anti-competitive behaviour from $50 million to $100 million. So, needless to say, do try and stay within the law if you can. And finally, there are some modest measures to address the housing shortage. The government says it wants to cut red tape here by making all mandatory Australian standards free across construction and work health and safety in particular. It's estimated this will save small electrical, plumbing and construction firms up to $1,600 in fees each year, which is not insignificant when you're strapped for cash. And it plans to invest about $85 million to speed up skills assessments for migrant trade workers, which it hopes will cut the time taken to enter the workforce by up to 6 months. All up, quite a few measures to win the small business vote.
I want to get a bit more reaction to this budget tonight. We heard there the references to what this means for business. Well, Brand Black is the head of the Business Council of Australia, joining us this evening. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Kristen Sobek is an economist at the University of Canberra. Thank you for your time. And Michelle O'Neill, the president of the ACTU. Good to see you all. Well, Brand Black, first to you. What do you think for business? What does this budget mean?
Well, we've seen there are some really good productivity announcements that have been made, and we applaud the Treasurer for the steps that he's taken with respect to those productivity reforms that have been announced tonight. Equally, we've been pleased to see the resilience package. That is also very strong. We are concerned by the taxation package. We don't support the changes that have been made with respect to...
Across all 3 areas, capital gains, negative gearing and trusts?
That's correct. As we see it, this is a overall net negative in terms of investment attractiveness from a taxation settings perspective. And we are concerned that the benefits for housing that come about as a consequence of those changes, certainly in terms of CGT and negative gearing, are marginal.
Okay. Well, Kristen, what do you make of those tax changes in particular? You've looked at these tax base for a long time from an academic point of view. Is it going to hurt investments, or is this a worthwhile thing to do?
I think that's a hard question. But what I do know is that if we look at how we tax savings in the current system, the proposed reforms seem to address the inconsistent way that Australia taxes savings. So specifically, what we know is that the types of savings that we tax the least have the biggest barriers to entry, namely owner-occupied housing, while the types of savings that we tax the most have the lowest barriers to entry, personal savings accounts. So what this reform actually aims to do is kind of equalize taxation across different forms of savings. The intent here, I would actually argue, is actually more positive for investment, in the sense that by equalizing taxation, the effective rate of taxation across different types of savings, investors can choose to invest as a function of their preferences for risk, liquidity, and return, rather than, in the instance of negative gearing, because it happens to be preferentially taxed, or real estate properties.
And Michelle, we know the ACTU's been calling for these sorts of tax changes and more that haven't been announced tonight, but we can come to that. You'd be happy with where the government's landed here?
Well, we actually called for them on your program for the first time in August last year, David, and changes to the capital gains tax, negative gearing and discretionary trusts are all really important changes because this budget really does start to tip the scales back to make it a fairer country for working Australians. And we want to see that fairness. And the current system isn't fair. It's not fair that working people pay their fair share of tax, but professional investors pay their accountants and their lawyers. I mean, it's important that people pay their fair share, and this is about balancing that up. And a good example is if you take Sonia, who's a nurse, she earns $90,000 and pays $25,000 in tax, but her landlord, Malcolm, he earns $90,000 of income, but because of tax discounts and dividends, he pays $2,000 in tax. Now, that's a broken system. So seeing the budget rebalance back towards making sure that workers have a fair go in the system and housing affordability for working people and young people is just a critical change that we need to see happen.
Brand, do you accept that example of Sonia and Malcolm, the landlord, and that huge tax difference?
Well, I think there are a few points that I'd make in that regard. The first thing is that certainly in terms of the tax changes that have been made for housing, as has already been noted, the only net impact that they deliver is 30,000 new homes over 10 years. So that's 3,000 homes a year. Let's consider that in the context of the government's objective to deliver 240,000 homes each year between 2025 and 2030. That's just over 1%. So it's a marginal
It may not do, yeah, exactly, marginal for supply, but getting owners into the market rather than investors.
Indeed. So the critical point that I would make there is that if we're talking about intergenerational equity, there are two key things that we've got to remember. In the context of cost of living, it is unquestionably driving productivity that is going to make the change. The Treasurer made that point himself this evening. If we're talking about wages growth, his point in his budget speech this evening was in order to deliver real wage increases, we need to have productivity increases.
Sure, and that's a separate argument, but to the point about getting more owner-occupiers in rather than investors, isn't that a good thing?
It is a good thing, but I'm just not convinced by the measures that have been announced tonight that we are going to see a material change in that regard. Again,
so what are you worried about
those figures? Well, what we're concerned about is that we are imposing higher taxes, and the net effect of that is that we are imposing higher taxes in an economy that is already uncompetitive with respect to our rankings vis-a-vis other developed economies. On our rankings, we're 38th of 42 on tax settings alone.
Okay.
We don't want to see ourselves go further backwards.
Kristen, just on what younger Australians locked out of the market should realistically expect. We've seen tonight in the budget papers, and we'll hear from the government about, yes, housing's become so unaffordable over the last 20 years, but will these changes tonight make a big difference or a marginal difference?
On the one hand, I agree with Bran that I think there's consensus among economists that housing really is a supply issue. That's kind of, if we think about first-pass policy, it's really related to supply. What I can say on the tax side, though, is that the measures proposed by this government will temper the demand for real estate investment properties, which, when we look at this kind of hodgepodge of certain assets taxed here and others here, equalising that most certainly will temper demand and help. So I think younger generations should be optimistic, but we do need much more action on the supply side.
Just very quickly, Michelle, to you, you didn't get the gas tax that the unions have been calling for. And in terms of returning this revenue to workers, there's a bit, but would you want more of this revenue over time to be returned to workers?
Well, can I just pick up one thing though, just on that? Since John Howard introduced those changes to capital gains and negative gearing, house prices have gone up 400%, whereas working full-time workers' wages have gone up just half of that.
Yeah, there might be a bunch of reasons,
there's a lot of
including
reasons, but on your point, I mean, we understand that the government leaning in to having more secure fuel has been essential for Australia. And you know what it's been essential for? It's a job-saving measure. That's what it's done, because agriculture jobs, aviation jobs, manufacturing jobs, If we weren't getting fuel in and keeping those prices under control, they're the people, those workers are paying the price of Donald Trump's war. So they're really important measures. We, of course, want to see those big gas companies pay their fair share of tax, and that issue is something that's going to continue to be an issue. But we understand why it is that there's been this emphasis on getting fuel security for Australia.
Michelle O'Neill, Dr. Kristen Sobeck and Bran Black, thank you very much for joining us on this budget evening. Well, sometimes it's not just what the commentators say, but what the cartoonists draw that can define a budget. So time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
The budget tree behind me here has dropped all of its colour, and here we are, this government's 5th attempt at a federal budget, a budget they've described as their most ambitious yet. Me, I'm ambitious for my visual colleagues, cartoonist for the Australian Financial Review, David Rowe, and photographer for AAP, Lucas Koch. Let's go and see what they're up to for Budget 2026. Hi David, welcome to Budget 2026.
Hey Mike.
This is apparently the government's most ambitious budget. Are you being ambitious in your cartoon?
I'm being allowed to be ambitious this year. I've done a bit, they've given me a bit more space.
Right.
So I'm sort of popping up into the headline and sort of, exploding.
Filling it out.
Yeah, more of an illustration for the cover.
Yeah.
Anyway, and then cartoon, I'll sort of, once we're in lockup and I get a bit more information.
The usual themes, of course, Donald Trump up here,
Donald,
ever-present,
he's
and the Treasurer.
It's not all about Jim.
No.
No.
You're less ambitious in your colour.
Yeah, and everyone gives me a hard time with all the poo stains and everything, so I'll rein it back in again a bit.
Yeah, guys, how are you? Thanks for doing that. So, Dave, we're into the lockup now, and have the budget papers revealed any coalescing moment where you've gone, bing, I know what I'm doing?
Just been eavesdropping on Phil.
Yeah.
Etal, and I think I'm fairly happy with where I'm going with the cartoon and the cover that I'm doing.
The wisdom of Corey is weaved into your work, is what you're saying.
Well, yeah, the little tasteful turds at the bottom, maybe. Might be in there.
So where do you think it will head from here? You've got a lot of colour to add to it. Obviously.
Yeah, I've got to add the red leaves, which will really make it punchy. I just like the idea of Angus and Tim sitting up in the tree like little vultures,
ready to pounce.
Yeah, exactly.
Sprung like coils.
So you're throwing forward to tomorrow's paper.
Here we are in the lockup press conference room. Lucas, it's pretty much the same as it was last year, is it not? What are you looking for that's new and fresh?
Yeah, to be honest, I think today it looked actually a little worse than
last year. It's gone downhill.
Yes, I think we're not getting better, definitely.
Lift your game, Treasurer.
I brought in this ring flash. It's a big unit.
It surrounds the lens, but it's a very harsh light.
Yeah, it's a direct light in your face. And it makes the colours pop, and it creates like a halo around. I think the Treasurer said it's 5 budgets in one.
Yeah.
I thought I'd bring the big flash.
5 flashes in one.
That's right.
Well done, Lucas. David, here we are at the business end of the lockup, and there's a lot of artwork here. So a little cheeky bit of builder's crack in Jim and Albo, and this is the political cartoon.
That's the political cartoon.
Angus and Tim are negatively geared.
Yeah.
Perfect. And so what's for the cover?
The cover's this one.
Yeah. Trump swinging in here on the came in like a wrecking ball.
Property ladder. Yeah, you sort of leave everything a bit loose.
We're ready to rock and roll.
Yeah.
I'll let you do the honours.
Good on you. Back to you, Spearsy.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Lucas. Thank you, Mike. Just love seeing how they get it. I don't know how they get it all done in one afternoon. Anyway, let's get back to our panel here. Melissa Clark, Jacob Grieber, Patricia Caravellis. PK, from what we've heard so far this evening, and we're only a couple of hours in, will this budget and the main measures pass through this building, through the Parliament?
Yes, with the support of the Greens. Now, it's been reported based on what Larissa said to you a little earlier and others that perhaps that might be harder. I think that's a little smoke and mirrors from the Greens. I think they absolutely will pass this through. That doesn't mean they won't make a bit of noise along the way. That is their way, but they will pass this. In fact, Nick McKim spoke to me a little earlier today and he said, look, we're not going to let, the perfect be the enemy of the good.
That was before he even saw it.
That's right, because he said if it's moving in this direction, they will absolutely support it. The coalition will vote against it. And a bit of mail on this. Not only will they support it, but the government will seek to pass this legislation and get it through the parliament as soon as it possibly can, on the premise that it wants this issue to be neutralised by the next election. They actually
That's why they're doing it now.
They want to be promising tax cuts at the next election. And the caveat on that, the coalition is now in some trouble on that because they'll want to offer tax cuts too, right? But they're not getting the revenue by stopping it. They will have to be telling us whether they'll be increasing revenue, like basically.
Okay, so the next question will be, are they going to repeal?
Yeah.
That'll be the question that'll follow all of this. What are the risks and rewards for the coalition, do you think, Jacob, in the position they've landed on tonight?
I think Patricia's really right. There's a real danger there that they get pulled onto the government's terrain here. This is all laid out for the government to have a good old ding-dong with the opposition on terms that they're setting. They're the ones batting for younger Australians. They're the ones, as you heard from Michelle from the ACTU, they're the ones batting to make the tax system fairer. The coalition has to then disprove that and not be seen to be just, looking after people who are comfortable. So that's not where they'll want to be. They'll want to be on very different ground. And my sense is they'll have something quite different to say tomorrow night with the reply.
Thursday night,
Thursday night with the reply from Angus Taylor, and that will be a critical moment. They'll want to shift off this, I suspect, because this is not easy territory necessarily.
That's a good point. It will become a battle of advocacy here, as ever. Mel, we promised some productivity. Just tell us, we've heard a lot from Jim Chalmers about all the measures here that are going to boost productivity. What does his own budget say about whether it will?
Well, this is the really interesting thing, right? Right from the beginning of this term of Parliament, Jim Chalmers set this up as the term to deal with that great big thorny issue of productivity. Here's my round table of days on end of discussion to do that. Here's my list of measures. Well, the Treasury forecasts the long-term assumption for productivity growth is 1.2%. Sorry, drum roll. And the thing is, the 1.2% is exactly what it is currently and what it is when Treasury... No change. When Treasury downgraded it when the Albanese government came in from 1.5 to 1.2, it's showing no material difference.
Even though there are lots of productivity measures in the budget.
Just to keep it where it is. All right. Well, look, we're out of time. We'll get plenty of analysis from all of you, I'm sure, in the days ahead. PK, Jacob, Mel, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thanks for your company as well. Tomorrow, the Treasurer and the PM will be doing the big sell on this budget. Thursday will be the big test that we were talking about for Angus Taylor and his budget reply. And we'll be back with all the wash-up on Sunday morning for Insiders. Hope you can join us then. Bye for now.
Welcome to the Business Budget Special. Tonight we'll dissect the most significant tax changes in more than a quarter of a century with experts and our business specialists, looking at what it means for investors, business and the economy.
We'll unpack the implications for the housing market and the building industry.
And I'll be talking to the co-founder of a grocery delivery company about whether the budget does enough to tackle the rising costs of doing business.
Joining me with their takes from tonight's budget are our chief correspondent, Ian Verinder, former Productivity Commission Chair and E61 Institute CEO Michael Brennan, and middle market consulting firm RSM Australia economist Devika Shivadekar. First to you, Ian. Welcome, of course, to you all. Ian, this has been billed as a reform budget. Is it? Are taxpayers going to remember this one?
They'll certainly remember it. And, when tax reform has to be probably the most misused term when it comes to anything to do with business, because it usually means give me a tax cut and you can pick up the difference. But this is a tax reform budget because instead of just cutting taxes, it's cutting, it's taking out tax breaks.
OK. Devika, it is a tough economic climate. Business confidence is plummeting at the moment. What is in this budget for the business community?
I think, Kirsten, it's quite a bit of a mixed bag, I would say. There are a lot of positives and, in fact, some that leave a lot to be desired. Off the top of my head, I would still think that most of the reforms that have been mentioned are, in fact, working towards improving business sentiment. Top of the list would probably be the R&D tax incentive, the loss carryback that they have introduced in this budget, and of course the CGT and discretionary trusts, which are more geared towards making sure that businesses are more streamlined and nobody's really taking advantage of the tax benefits.
Will that final one have taken the business community by surprise?
No, not really.
No, they were prepared for something along those lines, given the huge amount of discussion about upcoming tax changes.
Precisely. So they had factored those in to a certain extent, and I think what helped most was in detail that we have more clarity on what all of those measures are now outlining. So what we had already heard before today's budget delivery was pretty much factored in by businesses in their strategies.
Michael, the Treasurer says the government is doing the hard work of budget repair, yet gross debt will total $1 trillion within months for the first time. I think we do have a graphic for that, actually, if we can go to that now. Can both of those things be true? Can there be budget repair and debt topping $1 trillion?
Yeah, well, the budget improves in every year, the budget bottom line, albeit there's about $6 billion worth of policy decisions that worsen the bottom line in the next 2 years, but they're covered by the revenue gain from the higher commodity prices as a result of the turmoil in Iran. But over the medium term, it's a much better looking trajectory. We return to surplus a year earlier than previously. The thing I will say is there will be a lot of talk about the tax measures in this budget, but by far the biggest thing going on. The biggest single measure in this is the NDIS save. That is the thing that underpins the fiscal trajectory. It's very significant. The execution will be key. Getting 2% growth in the NDIS will be absolutely critical if we are to achieve the sort of fiscal trajectory that the budget is projecting.
Given what we've seen in the past, do you reckon it's achievable?
Well, the difficulty is in this budget, there was actually an upwards revision to the cost before we even started of $13 billion. So that was notwithstanding all of the previous attempts to get the growth rate in at 8%, etc. There's more faith, I think, and at least the government has stared this issue in the face, outlined where it's going to try and make these changes. They are hard because they do involve assessments, they do involve taking people off the scheme. But these are very, very significant saves, no question.
OK, there is a lot more to drill into, and we will come back to our panel to do just that. But the government has been dropping hints for weeks, and we now do have details of those tax reforms Labor has long wanted to implement. Let's go to David Taylor with a further look at what they mean for investors.
Millions of Australians who invest in the share market, like Liam Walsh, are crunching the numbers from the government's tax reforms. He owns $3 million of high-growth stocks.
I'm looking for some tissues to cry into because nearly all of my income that I derive comes from capital growth.
From July next year, the government will scrap the 50% tax discount on capital gains for all assets except those in superannuation and some trusts. In its place, a return to 1999, where only real gains above inflation are taxed at a minimum rate of 30%. But gains accrued prior to next year will retain the 50% discount.
I actually support the policy. I think it's a really good policy. It sucks for me because I'm going to lose money.
We're discriminating against growth assets, that asset class that generates the biggest gains for economies through time.
Not all investors will be worse off under the changes. Those with gains well ahead of inflation will pay more, while those tracking closer to it will fork out less.
I think that the changes could be pretty far-reaching and they could have much wider consequences than people are potentially expecting.
Investment fund founder Chris Breike worries the changes will hurt aspiring homeowners who are buying speculative shares to save for a deposit.
And that's still possible in a diversified portfolio. It just becomes a little bit less appealing, and potentially the lower risk investment options that we offer will become more popular because they have more government bonds and lower risk investments which are hit less by this new tax.
The capital gains tax changes also apply to property investors, except those buying new homes, to boost supply.
A major or drastic move like that can also, there'll be a ripple effect.
From next July, negative gearing is limited to new properties. Existing investments are grandfathered, except those bought after tonight. Property prices are expected to slow.
I do think that we will see an exodus of investors.
And Domain's Nicola Powell worries renters could suffer.
We already have very tight rental markets and very low vacancy rates. It's still a landlord's market across Australia. And I think that exodus of investors is obviously going to have a detrimental impact overall on vacancy rates.
Budget papers estimate the reforms are likely to have a small impact on rents, adding less than $2 a week to the current median rental price.
The government says these tax changes are all about intergenerational fairness. It says it's working with the states to support renters, and the reforms will help 75,000 more Australians get a foot on the property ladder over the next 10 years.
Well, will the Treasurer sign that one in blood? Because, I mean, who knows, right?
For Liam Walsh and his family, every measure counts in the pursuit of home ownership.
I have a 22-year-old daughter, going to want her to buy a house. And right now, she can't.
A budget with the promise now of levelling the playing field for first home buyers to realise the dream of home ownership.
Sold. Congratulations and well bought to you, folks.
David Taylor there. Let's get more on how the reforms will impact the property market and go to Michael Yanda. Michael, you're with industry insiders tonight. What do they make of the changes?
Well, Kirsten, joining me now are Nerida Conisbee from Ray White Real Estate Group, their chief economist, and Brad Armitage from the Housing Industry Association. Nerida, first up, what do you think the effect on prices will be from these tax changes?
It'll definitely slow down price growth, primarily because we will see a drawback in investor activity. But because we're seeing a drawback in investor activity, it is likely to lead to fewer rental properties. And so basically what we think, it will shift the pressure from pricing to rents, and rents will accelerate at a faster rate than prices.
So if you had to put a number on it, what kind of price decline do you think we might see as a result of these changes compared to what we would see otherwise? Treasury estimated 2%. Do you think that's in the ballpark?
Yeah, look, it's very hard to tell. I mean, if you've got markets like Perth sitting at 25%, you've got markets like Melbourne sitting at around 4%. There's definitely a floor at which as to how much prices can fall, primarily because construction costs are so high at the moment. So replacement costs for buildings or for houses is very high, and so that will keep pricing elevated long term.
And on the rental front, the government estimated that it might impact rents by $2 a week for a typically priced rental property. Do you again think that's in the ballpark, or would you expect a bigger effect?
Look, it does depend. I mean, if we've looked at places like Victoria, we've very clearly seen that higher taxes on investors has discouraged investors. In 1 year, we saw a loss of 20,000 20,000 rental properties in that market. We did see rents moving at double the pace of what we saw prices. So at this point, it is difficult to tell, but we do think there'll be a fairly immediate impact on what happens to rentals.
And Brad, obviously rents are really driven by supply and demand, and from the housing sector, supply is a key issue the government's trying to boost. What effect do you think the budget will have on boosting supply?
Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag, Michael. On the one hand, there is an additional $2 billion for last mile infrastructure, and $500 million of that is set aside for regional Australia, so that's positive. On the negative side, we have changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax, and the budget papers themselves earmark that we're projected to build 35,000 less homes over the next decade due to those changes. Now, in a housing crisis, any measure that will reduce the amount of homes we build is not a really good thing to do for overall supply.
The government did say in those same Treasury papers that the supply measures, the $2 billion infrastructure fund announced, would boost housing supply by 65,000, so they're claiming a net gain of 30,000 homes. Do you think that's realistic based on what you've seen in the budget?
Well, it really depends on how the infrastructure money gets to where it needs to go. We need to make sure that there aren't barriers to it getting to those local councils that need it and the infrastructure gets put in place. But I guess our question would be, why now? Why in a housing crisis would you do anything that has a negative impact on investor activity and investors entering the market right now?
So obviously the government has grandfathered the changes to negative gearing for existing investors. Likewise, the capital gains tax changes don't come in and are prospective from July 1, 2027. Do you think that does enough to safeguard investors in the market, or do you expect to see some exit?
It will definitely safeguard rental properties. I mean, if they did remove negative gearing on people that were already negative gearing, we would have seen a run on sales, and so people getting out of the market quite quickly.
And a much bigger price fall.
And a much bigger price fall, but a much bigger jump in rental prices as well. So I think on one hand they did have to grandfather it, but I think then coming back to intergenerational issues, I think a lot of younger people would perhaps be thinking that on one hand, we're seeing all these changes coming through, but then on the other hand, there are older Australians who are taking advantage of negative gearing, and it's not something that they'll be able to take advantage of.
So, in effect, the drawbridge has been pulled up.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of that, though, if we did see investors sell, presumably they would be selling to either other investors or prospective owner-occupiers, and the government is claiming that there could be 75,000 extra homeowners and an increase in the home ownership rate due to these policies. Do you buy it?
Well, I mean, potentially, but I think there's a bit of a misconception around someone. We have someone who's renting, they become a first home buyer, and suddenly you've solved the problem and everything's sorted out. The reality, though, is that we do have a flow of people coming through, and people rent because they leave home, they rent because they have a marriage breakdown, and also they rent because they're moving into a city. And labour mobility is so important for rental markets. And it's important to have really well-functioning rental markets for labour mobility. So all of these things start to become challenging longer term if we don't have enough rental properties available.
Now, in terms of creating more rental properties, again, the government's claiming this will tend to boost apartment supply. Do you see any other positives in this budget for the construction sector?
Well, there was a small win for small businesses and builders and tradies, and that is the free Australian standards. In the budget papers, it's around $1,600 a year saving for those businesses, but more importantly, it'll help to improve compliance as well.
Well, the housing industry crisis and the house price crisis in Australia has been nearly 3 decades in the making, so it's a bit much to expect it to be solved in one budget. Thank you both for joining us. Back to you in the studio, Kirsten.
Some good analysis there, Michael. Thank you, and to your industry insiders as well. Let's bring our studio panel back into the conversation now about how tonight's budget measures are going to land for the business community. Devika, I'm going to come back to you. What is the sector going to make of the government's move to raise taxes on income in discretionary taxes, or discretionary trusts rather? Yeah. It's going to impose a minimum 30% tax.
Yeah, I think, Kirsten, look, the 30% minimum tax on discretionary trust distribution is expected to be paid by the trustee who makes the payments. Now, looking at the broader numbers, it affects a rather relatively small number of businesses, but the reality remains that when faced with a dilemma, they obviously have just a choice either to restructure or to pay up. Having said that, rollover relief is available if they do choose to restructure, but stamp duty and operational disruptions are indeed a live issue. Unlike companies, the core issue here with trusts is that they cannot use those franking credits to overnight turn into fixed trusts or companies. Having said all that, and the challenges that it does bring, it's actually a welcome move, because invariably discretionary trusts were actually used for tax avoidance more than to support businesses. So broadly, I would say it's a welcome move, but it definitely comes with its share of challenges.
I was going to ask you, Ian, I mean, a relatively small number of businesses, yes, but the government does estimate that they will total some 350,000 businesses. And this measure is expected to raise $4.5 billion in its first year of operation alone. So clearly the government did have its sights set on these businesses. And were they just setting about to evade tax?
Well, that seems to be the primary, I guess, modus operandi. That's the primary, motive to do so. But if you're going to, I think you come to a situation where you go, do I keep my money in a discretionary trust, or do I transfer it into a company structure and pay the 30%? Much simpler. You can then, distribute the cash via fully franked dividends to the what used to be the trust, those accepting the money. Much simpler process.
Do you think, Michael, that that trustees are going to plan to do that, to try to rearrange their affairs as a consequence of this measure?
I suspect that's the case. I think the government is expecting that. That's why, as Devika said, they've put in place the rollover relief, that expecting that a number of small businesses will decide that a discretionary trust is not the right vehicle. Let's see, there could be some unintended consequences. I'll be interested to see whether, for example, those restructures might trigger a stamp duty liability. In some cases, when you shift from a trust into a company or some other thing, it may be that the Commonwealth needs to enlist the states in a bit of a cooperative endeavour to provide similar rollover relief to what they are providing in relation to a CGT event, for example. But let's see how it pans out. There is some time, because this doesn't take effect for a few years yet.
Trusts are very expensive to maintain, though, aren't they, and operate? So wouldn't it be simpler to just transfer your assets into a company structure?
Yeah, and I think it remains to be seen. That may well be the most popular vehicle for many.
Mm.
Let's talk about startups. There had been some concerns from the startup sector ahead of this budget about how the scrapping of the CGT discount would impact them. But the government has actually extended a number of measures, it says, are designed to encourage investment and risk-taking. Will they work?
Well, I guess the thinking is that it's better to provide cash in the early stages of a startup rather than to say, well, here's a capital gains tax that you can get, a discount that you can get once you sell the business. And so that's the general thinking. So there's a number of, measures that are there that, Devika, you could probably go into in greater detail than I could.
Yeah. So, when it comes to risk-taking, I think Australia lags when we compare it to the rest of the peers, developed nation peers, when it comes to investment in tech. And that's probably because risk appetite has always been quite lower in Australia compared to our peer countries. And this indeed gives a fair chance to those ambitious startups or businesses who are keen to take those chances and won't be penalized, even if maybe it doesn't work out in the first go. So that's where this loss carryback actually comes into play. And it pretty much sets up every business to at least take one step forward rather than stay put. And taking one step forward and learning a lesson is any day better than just standing where you are and wondering what if it would have worked out. So just to maybe, it's very simple. So the loss carryback, it completely fixes that asymmetry that comes with losses that you've made previously, the gains that you made in a good year. If you've made losses now, you just need to, work backwards and you'll still earn.
What do these types of measures mean in terms of productivity growth? Is what we've heard tonight going to nudge growth higher?
I think nudge is a good word. The productivity package as a whole is workmanlike. It's worthwhile. It tends to be kind of small things, but there are some good things in there. There's a bit of streamlined regulation, a bit of faster skills recognition. There's the abolition of some nuisance tariffs. There's the free standards that Brad mentioned before. All of these things are of themselves small, maybe not going to change your life, but they add up. I think the tax measures are interesting, I think, and potentially very positive. On the R&D tax incentive, for example, there are some changes there. It's interesting that it's actually a save overall because it's taking out some of the more peripheral R&D activity, focusing on the core. But what's interesting is that the refundable offset is now being restricted to young firms, not just small and medium firms, but young firms that are within the first 10 years of life. And I think that is the right approach. It's focusing that incentive much more on this life cycle effect, giving cash flow support to firms when they're trying to they're undertaking some risky investment or R&D early in their life. And, we believe that that's where the engine of growth will come from. Look, on productivity generally, I think the budget is honest about productivity. It's fairly realistic in saying that it will take longer for us to get back to even the steady state of 1.2% annual productivity growth. But I don't think that's a reflection on the package. A lot of what drives this is out of the government's control, and you do all these things, you stack the odds in your favour, you just work on multiple fronts as best you can.
Okay. Now, the food sector is one of the hardest hit by the rising costs as the result of the energy shock. Alicia Barry is with one of the founders of a grocery delivery business, Farmers Pick, to find out how he has received this budget. Alicia.
Hi Kirsten, I'm in a Sydney food distribution warehouse with Josh Ball. He is the founder of a company that buys farm fresh produce the supermarkets reject and has it delivered around the country. Josh Ball, welcome. Your business is predicated on reducing food waste, fuel, fertiliser, major inputs. The government's $14.8 billion fuel security package, does that give you comfort?
With our business, we're frequently talking to farmers, and I think this will be generally really welcomed. Fertiliser and diesel are really the backbone of our food system, and being able to have some confidence that this isn't going to be a problem for a little bit longer will definitely buoy the spirits.
Consumers, though, have been doing it tough. Have you seen changes in consumer behaviour? I mean, they're going to have a bit more cash in their pocket in 2028.
Yeah, so in a couple of years they might have a little bit more cash to splash, and that will be great. But at the moment, I think what we're really seeing is people are making more considered purchases. They're thinking about it a bit harder and really weighing up their decision in the family budget. Something that we're really proud to do with our customers is to give them the option to be able to both save on produce, support farmers, and also, save some money along the way.
I mean, the government is also working to try and encourage business innovation. There's a number of tax breaks and measures, including the 2-year carryback. How is that going to help?
So where we see that potentially playing in, I think with business, there's a whole set of risks that we play into, and being able to have that somewhat de-risked or be able to have the flexibility really enables businesses to sustain challenging periods like shocks that we've just been through with fuel and fertiliser, as well as come out the other side and continue to compete against the large corporations and the environment that we're in. So ultimately what I see in this for consumers at the end of the day is a more competitive place where small medium businesses can compete on the big stage.
And just very briefly, what would you make of the budget overall? Would you welcome what's been delivered tonight?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of initiatives there for consumers, for businesses. It's still a lot to digest, obviously, but there's definitely some positive things. I think this was a very, a critical budget across the board. There's a lot of challenges, with everyone from cost of living through to farmers and all of these supply shocks that we've been facing into. But yeah, I think there's definitely some things to get stuck into.
A lot of reading for you tonight. Josh Ball, thank you so much.
Thanks.
From the warehouse in Sydney, Kirsten, back to you in the studio.
Thanks so much. Now, we've got one final window to get some final thoughts from our panel about how this budget is going to leave the economy. Ian, the headline cash deficit, which includes off-budget measures, is forecast to some 2.1%, a 2.1% share of GDP in the new financial year. Is the government vulnerable to further accusations that its spending is too high?
It's certainly been under attack for spending for quite some time, and I think that message has resonated with not just the Treasurer but the Prime Minister as well. So they've certainly tried to bring that back into line. The growth is nowhere near what I think people would have expected. And so I think they've done a reasonable job to try to get it back under control. There is a slight reduction there.
Michael, investing too much in off-budget measures such as the Snowy Hydro and national resilience measures such as aluminium smelters and the like under the Future Made in Australia program, is it something that the government just has to do given the uncertain geopolitical nature in which we're living right now?
Yeah, I think some things do fit that description. By no means not all of Future Made in Australia. I think there's a lot of scope for some of that money to be wasted on some fairly peripheral things. But there's no doubt that on some of these industry protection issues or bailout issues, they are very complicated. You know, compared to what we went through with even the automotive industry many years ago. That was politically hard, but it was actually conceptually a no-brainer. Some of these issues around the smelters, around Whyalla, around Tomago, they're actually quite complex. There's a lot of uncertainty. There are a lot of issues about sovereign vulnerability. So it's not as straightforward as simply saying, no, just don't go there.
Just briefly, what shouldn't we be spending money on?
Well, I think we shouldn't necessarily be trying to chase, you know, the glittering new thing. You know, I think government's track record in finding new growth industries and that sort of thing is pretty poor. I think we should be just playing defence on these things. We should be trying to maintain a bit of option value, buy some time in relation to a couple of these key things where we think there is a significant sovereign vulnerability. But I think that's about the limit of it.
Davika, Treasury is forecasting that headline inflation will rise beyond the RBA's forecast of 4.8 to 5% in the June quarter before falling back to the RBA's target in the midpoint of the band within a year. Do you think the government in this budget has been mindful to address the inflation challenge?
I think so, yes, Kirsten. Definitely it's mildly expansionary, I would say, but definitely not reckless, and one of the more responsible ones we've seen in the last couple of years. You know, there's a clear intent of keeping fiscal policy from undercutting the efforts of the monetary policy. So both are in line, working towards the common goal of bringing price pressures under control. And of course, you know, measures such as tax cuts, healthcare support, business support, they all work on the structural side of things, which is very different to cash handouts, which actually risk stoking inflation. So when the reforms are more on the structural side of things, you definitely tend to tackle the problem of inflation, and the budget definitely speaks to that.
Okay, 20 seconds, final thoughts. Ian, you first.
Well, I thought it was a relatively good budget, really, and quite interesting. That's me. No,
that
really.
Was brief and to the point.
But honestly, most budgets tend to be quite boring. We do our best to, you know, make them look exciting, but, you know.
Okay, Michael?
The government did not succumb to the temptation to provide broad cost of living relief beyond what they'd already announced. A relatively modest working tax offset. Once again, and I'm a broken record on this, I do find it interesting that we've gone for relatively small relief to a very large number of households rather than trying to focus that assistance on low-income households where I think the need is greatest.
Okay, thank you to you all. That is where we will wrap our business budget special. A big thanks to all of our guest panellists, and on behalf of the business team, thank you for watching. We'll have more analysis tomorrow night at our regular time, and of course right across the ABC, including the Business Daily podcast budget special and of course ABC News Online. Ian, you've already got an analysis piece up there tonight. We will see you soon. Thanks.